Hey, come on in. Pull up your blanket, find that one perfect spot on your pillow, you know the one, and just let the day go. Whatever happened today, whatever is waiting for you tomorrow, none of that matters right now. Right now, it is just you and a story. And tonight's story begins with a question that I genuinely cannot stop thinking about. What if I told you that the most tightly controlled, most corseted, most rules-obsessed women in all of Western history, Victorian women, the ones in the long dresses with 17 buttons up the back, what if I told you that they had a richer, more passionate, more emotionally complex friendship culture than almost anything we have today? What if the women who were not allowed to vote, not allowed to own property in their own names, not allowed to speak first at a dinner table, what if those women were quietly building some of the most profound human bonds the modern world has ever seen? And what if society, their society, the one that locked them inside drawing rooms and told them to smile and pour tea, what if that same society not only allowed it but actually encouraged it? Tonight we're going behind the parlour door. We're going into the letters, the diaries, the secret jewellery, the coded languages and the hidden lives of Victorian women, and what we're going to find there is going to surprise you. But before we go any further, if this kind of story is your kind of story, would you do me a small favour? Hit that subscribe button, and while you're at it, give this video a like. It honestly means the world, and it helps more people find their way here to this little corner of history that we have made together. And I would love to know, where are you watching this from tonight? Are you in bed already? Lights off phone held above your face, hoping you do not drop it? Are you on the couch with a cup of something warm? Drop a comment down below, even just a word, even just your city. I read every single one. Now, dim the lights if you have not already. Maybe put a fan on low. There is something about soft background sound that makes a story feel more like a dream. And let us begin. The year is 1853. A woman named Eleanor is sitting at a writing desk in a townhouse in London. The candle beside her is burning low. Her husband has gone to bed. The house is quiet, and she is writing a letter. She writes for nearly an hour. The words come quickly, easily, in a way that words almost never come to her anymore. Not when she is writing to her mother, not when she is responding to a social invitation, not even in her own diary, but this letter the words practically pour out of her. She writes, "I think of you constantly. Every evening I sit and wish you were here beside me. There is no one else in the world who understands me as you do. I love you more than I am able to say." And then she folds the letter, seals it, and addresses it to her best friend. Now, if you read those words today out of context, you would probably assume this was a love letter, a romantic love letter, and you would wonder what on earth was going on in that London townhouse. But here is the thing. Eleanor was not hiding anything. She was not being scandalous. She was not even being particularly unusual. She was just writing to her friend. Because in Victorian England this was normal. This was how women wrote to each other. This was the language of female friendship, warm, passionate, emotionally direct, in a way that would make most of us blush today. And that right there is the central mystery we're going to spend tonight unpacking. How did a society so obsessed with propriety, so terrified of anything that looked like impropriety, produce a friendship culture among women that was by any modern measure extraordinarily intimate? The answer, as it turns out, has everything to do with power and with the strange, unexpected ways that powerless people find to live fully human lives. Let us set the scene properly, because context is everything here. The Victorian era officially runs from 1837, when Queen Victoria took the throne, to 1901, when she died. 64 years. Almost the entire second half of the 19th century. And during those 64 years, England and much of the Western world, since Victorian values spread well beyond Britain's borders, was in the grip of what historians call the doctrine of separate spheres. The idea was simple, and it was considered completely natural. Practically scientific men belonged to the public world. Work politics, business law, intellectual life, that was the male sphere. Women belonged to the private world. Home, family, domesticity, piety, that was the female sphere. The word used most often for the ideal Victorian woman was angel. Specifically, the angel in the house, a phrase that comes from an 1854 poem by Coventry Patmore, and which became almost a cultural obsession. The perfect woman was selfless, gentle, morally pure, devoted to her husband and children, and completely happily contained within her domestic world. She did not have opinions on politics. She did not pursue ambitions. She did not have what the Victorians would have called needs, at least not needs of her own. Now, here is where it gets interesting. When you take a human being, a fully feeling, fully thinking, fully emotional human being, and you tell her that she cannot have a career, cannot vote, cannot own property, cannot express anger, cannot be ambitious, cannot take up space in any meaningful public way, where does all of that go? It goes somewhere. It has to go somewhere. And for Victorian women, a great deal of it went into their friendships with each other. Historians have been studying this for decades, and the picture that emerges from all that research is genuinely stunning. Sharon Marcus, a professor at Columbia University, wrote a groundbreaking book on this topic called Between Women, published in 2007. In it, she examined hundreds of Victorian novels, memoirs, letters, and fashion magazines, and what she found completely upended the conventional story we tell about Victorian women. She found that friendships between women were not just common in Victorian England. They were central. They were the emotional backbone of most middle-class women's lives. They were encouraged by society, celebrated in novels, and conducted with an intensity and a tenderness that we have almost completely forgotten. Victorian women wrote poems to each other. They made jewellery from each other's hair, literal locks of hair woven into lockets, bracelets, rings. This was not considered strange. This was considered touching. They shared beds during visits which could last for weeks. They used the word love, openly, freely, without a second thought. And the most remarkable part, society was completely fine with all of it. In fact, as Marcus argues, society was more than fine with it. Society actively benefited from it. Female friendships were encouraged because they were seen as training grounds for the virtues women would need in marriage: loyalty, selflessness, empathy, emotional attunement. The idea endorsed by writers like Sarah Ellis, who was something of the Victorian era's guide to proper womanhood, was that friendship trained women to be good wives. That friendship was essentially practice, which is either very sweet or slightly horrifying depending on how you look at it. But here is the thing about human beings. Give us a cage and we'll decorate it. Give us a small patch of freedom and we will plant a garden in it. Tell us that our friendships are just training wheels, and we will turn those friendships into the most meaningful relationships of our lives. That is exactly what Victorian women did. The friendships that were supposed to be preparation for marriage often became more sustaining than marriage itself. The emotional vocabulary that women developed with each other, the tenderness, the depth, the capacity to be fully known, these were things that the rigid structure of Victorian marriage, with all its hierarchy and formality, often could not provide. A woman could not easily disagree with her husband. She could not tell him she was unhappy. She could not ask him to understand her inner life. But she could write a 10-page letter to her best friend and say everything. And she did. Now I want to be careful here because this is where the history gets genuinely complicated, and the complicated parts are the most fascinating. When we talk about Victorian female friendship, we're not talking about a single simple thing. We're talking about a whole spectrum. At one end, ordinary, warm, close friendships between women who genuinely liked each other, supported each other through illness and childbirth and grief and boredom, and exchanged affectionate letters. At the other end, relationships so deep, so exclusive, so emotionally and sometimes physically intimate that by any modern definition they were partnerships. Women who lived together for decades, women who exchanged rings, women who left each other property in their wills. Women who, if you read their letters honestly, were clearly in love. And the bewildering, fascinating, historically significant thing is that all of it existed under the same umbrella, the same social acceptance, the same polite approval. Because Victorian society, for all its rigidity and all its rules, had a blind spot, or perhaps more accurately, a deliberate blind spot. Women in the dominant Victorian medical and social understanding were not considered to have strong sexual desires. They were seen as naturally pure, naturally modest, naturally above the concerns of the flesh, which meant that whatever was happening between women, however warm, however passionate, however physical, could always be explained away as simply friendship. It was the perfect cover. Whether it needed to be a cover at all, whether many of these women would have recognized themselves in modern categories of identity, is a question historians debate with great energy and not much consensus. But the practical effect was clear. Victorian women had a freedom in their relationships with each other that they did not have anywhere else, and this freedom shaped their entire world. It shaped the novels they read, because Victorian fiction is absolutely full of intense female friendships. George Eliot wrote them, Charlotte Brontë wrote them, Charles Dickens, of all people, wrote one of the earliest documented portrayals of what we might today call a lesbian relationship in a novel that most people have never heard of. It shaped the social movements they built because, as we'll discover later in our journey tonight, many of the women at the forefront of the suffrage movement, the women who fought hardest and most fearlessly for the right to vote, were women who lived in deep partnership with other women. Women who had, in a very real sense, already opted out of the system they were fighting to change, and it shaped something more private and more personal than any of that the inner lives of millions of ordinary women who left no famous names behind, but who left letters, stacks of letters in attics and archives, all across England and America, that testify to what it meant to be truly known by another person. So here is what we're going to do tonight. We're going to follow those women. We're going to learn the rules, the hidden rules, the unwritten codes, the strange social rituals that governed how Victorian women formed friendships, kept them, deepened them, and sometimes lost them. We're going to meet some remarkable individuals whose stories have been waiting sometimes for over 150 years to be told properly. And I genuinely think that by the time we are done, you're going to see something in this history that feels unexpectedly close to home. Because the questions at the heart of all of this are not really Victorian questions. What does it mean to be truly known by another person? What does it mean to love someone when the world gives you no language for it? What do we lose when we follow all the rules, and what do we find when we quietly, carefully break them? These are questions that belong to every era. They just happen to have some of their most beautiful answers in the parlour rooms and handwritten letters of 19th century England. So settle in. Close your eyes if you want to. Because we are just getting started, and the story that is coming next might be the most surprising one of all. Because it turns out that the very first rule of Victorian female friendship was not about warmth or loyalty or love. It was about a small piece of cardboard, and it was in its own way a form of war. Now, before I tell you about the piece of cardboard, I need you to picture something. Imagine you're a woman in London. The year is 1865. You're 24 years old. You've been introduced to a woman at a dinner party. A woman about your age, pleasant, well-read, someone who made you laugh twice over the soup course. You liked her immediately. You would genuinely like to see her again. So what do? You cannot simply send her a message. You cannot follow her. You cannot show up at her door and say, "Hello, I thought you were wonderful. Can we be friends?" No, no, no. There is a process. And that process begins with a rectangle of thick, cream-coloured paper, approximately 3 inches by 2 inches, engraved with your full name in elegant script. Your calling card. And what you do with that little piece of cardboard when you leave it, how you leave it, what you fold, what you bend, what you do with the corner, all of that carries meaning. Specific, intentional, socially loaded meaning that every woman in your world understood as clearly as you understand a text message today. Welcome to the most sophisticated social game the 19th century ever invented. And somehow, nobody taught it in history class. Here is the thing about Victorian etiquette that most people miss entirely. We tend to look back at all those rules, the elaborate manners, the formal introductions, the rigid protocols, and we think how suffocating, how exhausting, how utterly pointless. But that is the wrong way to read it. Because for Victorian women, particularly middle and upper class women, who had almost no formal power in any other domain of life, the social world was not just a set of constraints. It was a chessboard, and the calling card was their most powerful piece on it. Let me explain how it actually worked, because the details here are genuinely remarkable. Every respectable household had a silver tray or small table near the front entrance specifically designated for calling cards. When you came to visit someone and they were not home, or when they were home but you were making a formal call rather than an intimate visit, you left your card. But how you left it said everything about your intentions. If you folded the upper right corner of the card, it meant you had delivered it in person, rather than sending a servant. This was significant. This said, "I came myself. You matter enough to me that I did not delegate this." If you folded the upper left corner, it signalled congratulations, perhaps a wedding, a new baby, a social achievement. A folded lower right corner meant you were leaving the area saying goodbye, perhaps for a season, or even permanently. And if you left an unfolded card that was the coldest possible move, that was calling card language for "I am fulfilling my social obligation." Nothing more. The etiquette manuals of the period, and there were dozens of them, enormously popular, read by women the way lifestyle guides are read today, were incredibly specific about all of this. George Routledge published his Manual of Etiquette in 1860, and it went through edition after edition because women devoured it. Not because they needed to be told what to do, but because they wanted to understand every possible nuance in what other women were doing to them. Now here is where it gets deeply human. The morning call, or more accurately, the afternoon call, since morning visits were paid between 2 and 5 in the afternoon, which is either charmingly Victorian or evidence that the Victorians had a very flexible definition of morning. The visiting call was the primary mechanism through which women built, maintained, and occasionally destroyed their social relationships. You would arrive, you would be shown into the drawing room, you would sit fully corseted and gloved because you never removed your gloves during a call that was an intimacy reserved for close friends, and you would converse. About what exactly another Victorian woman's answer might surprise you. The etiquette books told women to keep conversation like children, household matters, perhaps some gentle commentary on a novel or a piece of music. Topics like politics, money, and religion were considered dangerously unsuitable for social calls. But here is what actually happened in those drawing rooms based on the letters and diaries women left behind. They talked about everything. They talked about their marriages carefully in code, in the way people talk about difficult things when they cannot say them directly. They shared medical worries, fears about pregnancy, grief about children lost. They gossiped sometimes with breathtaking sharpness. They formed and confirmed alliances. They assessed each other's situations and quietly strategized about how to help. The formal shell of the morning call contained an extraordinarily rich inner life, and women knew it. They counted on it. The visit was the scaffolding. The real conversation was what happened inside. I think about this sometimes, how much meaning people can pack into a constrained form. Think about haiku. 17 syllables, incredibly rigid. And yet somehow within those 17 syllables, Japanese poets have expressed the entire range of human emotion for centuries. Victorian women's social rituals were something like that. The tighter the external form, the more charged every tiny variation became. The language of the calling card worked because everyone agreed on its grammar. A bent corner meant something precisely because everyone knew what an unfolded card meant. And a woman who mastered this language, who understood every nuance, who knew exactly when to arrive, when to stay, when to leave her card, and when to send her maid instead, that woman held a kind of social power that was real, even if it was power of a very particular and circumscribed kind. Does that resonate with you at all? I am genuinely curious. Do you think you would have been good at this game? Because I honestly think about this and I am not sure I would have had the patience. Although I have to admit the idea of communicating through carefully folded stationery is somehow more satisfying than a read receipt that never gets a reply. But let us go deeper, because the calling card and the visiting ritual were really just the front door of the friendship. Once two women had moved past the formal visiting stage, once they had made what the Victorians called an intimacy, the entire register of their relationship shifted, and the most significant shift was in how they addressed each other. Among acquaintances, women used formal address, Miss followed by surname for unmarried women, Mrs followed by surname for married women. This was non-negotiable. You addressed someone you barely knew as Miss Hartley or Mrs Crawford. Period. No exceptions. But the moment a true friendship was established, and that moment was itself a kind of ritual, mutually acknowledged, sometimes even explicitly agreed upon, you moved to first names. This sounds small. It was not small. In a world where men in the upper classes went through their entire lives addressing their closest male friends only by surname, the move to first names among women was a genuine act of intimacy. It was a declaration: I see you as a person, not a title. I am letting you into my inner circle, and women took this transition seriously. The memoirs and letters of the period are full of moments where women describe the first time a friend called them by their given name, how it felt, what it meant, how it marked a before and after in the friendship. Now, there is a woman I want to tell you about because she illustrates all of this in a way that is almost too perfect. Her name was Isabella Beeton. You might know her better as Mrs. Beeton, the author of the extraordinarily famous book of household management published in 1861. It is one of the best-selling books in British history. More people in Victorian England owned a copy of Mrs. Beeton's book than owned almost any other book except the Bible, and the conventional image of Isabella Beeton is very much the angel in the house, made real, domestic, practical, the ultimate guide to running a proper Victorian home. But Isabella Beeton's private life tells a more complicated story. She was deeply, genuinely close to a circle of women friends, women she had known since her school days, women she corresponded with frequently and warmly throughout her short life. She died at the age of 28 in 1865 after giving birth to her fourth child, and in the letters she left behind you can see the texture of those friendships clearly. She wrote to her friends about her fears, about the difficulties of her marriage, which was loving but also financially strained in ways the public image of comfortable domesticity never showed, about the loneliness of her particular kind of fame, which was real even though she would not have used that word. Her friends wrote back with the same openness. They shared news, offered counsel, expressed affection, in terms that were completely standard for women of their era, warm, direct, emotionally available in a way that might catch you off guard if you stumbled across those letters today. What strikes me about Isabella Beeton is not that she was remarkable. It is that she was ordinary. Ordinary in the best possible sense, she was a regular Victorian woman navigating a life with genuine constraints and genuine longings, and she did it the same way most women of her era did, by holding her female friendships as something close to sacred. Let's talk about what happened when these friendships moved beyond the drawing room and into something more sustained. Because the morning call and the exchanged card were only the beginning. Once a friendship was established, women visited each other for extended stays, not a few hours but days, weeks, sometimes months. Think about what that meant practically. Two women sharing a bedroom was completely unremarkable. Women travelled together, slept in the same bed during visits, spent hours in physical proximity in a way that would register very differently today. This was not considered suggestive. It was considered normal, warm, appropriate. And within that physical closeness, friendships deepened in ways that the formal social rituals could only gesture toward. The letters women wrote during and after these extended visits are some of the most moving documents in Victorian social history. They describe the ache of separation, how quiet the house felt after a friend left, how the ordinary routines of the day seemed flattened without her presence. They use language that is by any measure the language of profound attachment. One detail that I find genuinely affecting it was common for women after a long visit from a close friend to write a letter that very same evening, not the next day. That evening while the friend was still travelling home. The separation was that immediate. The need to stay connected was that strong. And this brings me to something I want to say directly because I think it matters. We have somewhere in the last 100 years or so lost something. We have a word for romantic love. We have a word for family love. We have a word for the affection you feel for colleagues, for neighbours, for people you like but do not know well. But we have almost no language and very little cultural permission for the kind of love that those Victorian women were expressing in their letters and their rituals and their extended visits. The love of a deep female friendship. The love that is not romantic in the conventional sense, not familial, but is genuinely profound. That looks at another person and says, "You are necessary to me. My life is larger because you are in it." Victorian women had that language, they used it freely, and society, for all its faults and rigidities, gave them the space to use it. I think we're only beginning to understand what we lost when that space got narrower. There is one more piece of this particular picture that I want to share before we move on. The entire ritual of the morning call, the calling card, the formal introduction, the slow progression toward intimacy. All of it was undergirded by one unspoken principle. Women were the gatekeepers. In the etiquette manuals, this was stated quite explicitly. Routledge's manual said that when a gentleman was to be introduced to a lady, the gentleman was always introduced to her, never the other way around. The lady had to give at least implicitly her permission. She could not be introduced to someone without her consent being assumed. And in female friendships, this principle applied even more forcefully. A woman could not be made to befriend someone. The social machinery of Victorian life gave women remarkable control over who entered their intimate circle, even as it controlled almost everything else about their lives. The drawing room was yours, the calling card tray was yours. The decision to move from Miss Hartley to Charlotte, that was yours. In a world where you could not vote, could not hold a professional position in most fields, could not manage your own finances without your husband's involvement, this particular domain of life was genuinely meaningfully yours, and women knew it. They protected it. They exercised it with care and sometimes with great strategic intelligence. The calling card, the morning visit, the carefully calibrated address. These were not just social niceties. They were the architecture of a world that women built for themselves within the walls of the world that had been built around them. And here is what makes this even more fascinating. Once a woman was inside that inner circle, once the cards had been left and the calls had been paid and the first names had been exchanged, there was a whole other language waiting. A language that did not involve words at all. A language of objects of the most intimate, the most personal, the most permanent kind. Because Victorian women did not just write to each other and visit each other and call each other by their given names. They wore each other, quite literally. And the story of what they made and what they kept and what those objects meant, that story is coming up right now. There is a bracelet sitting in a museum archive in London right now that most visitors walk right past. It does not look like much at first glance. It is slim, darkish, woven in an intricate pattern, almost like a fine braid. If you did not know what it was made of, you might assume it was some kind of decorative cord. Horsehair, maybe, or thread. But it is not horsehair, and it is not thread. It is human hair. Specifically, it is the braided hair of two women, a woman named Catherine and her closest friend, whose name history has not preserved, woven together into a single piece of jewellery, clasped with a small gold fitting, and worn on Catherine's wrist every single day for the last 20 years of her life. When Catherine died in 1878, the bracelet was listed in her personal effects. Her family kept it, and eventually it made its way into an archive where it has sat ever since, quietly extraordinary, waiting for someone to understand what it meant. I think about that bracelet more than is probably reasonable, because what it represents, this small, intimate, slightly strange to modernize object, is the subject of this part of our story tonight. The language of objects. The way Victorian women turned the physical world into a vocabulary of love and loyalty that their spoken language was not always permitted to carry. Let me give you some context, because the hair jewellery phenomenon in Victorian England was not a niche practice. It was not the peculiarity of a few eccentric women. It was mainstream. At its peak in the middle of the 19th century, hair jewellery was so popular that it had its own dedicated section in every major women's magazine. Godey's Ladies' Book, the most widely read women's magazine in the United States at the time, with a circulation of roughly 150,000 readers, by the 1850s published detailed instructions for weaving hair into bracelets, lockets, watch chains and brooches. There were professional hair workers who could be hired to do the job for you. There were specialised tools sold in craft shops specifically for hair weaving. There were pattern books. This was an industry. Now we tend to associate Victorian hair jewellery primarily with mourning, with the custom of keeping a lock of hair from someone who had died as a keepsake. And yes, mourning jewellery was absolutely part of this world. The Victorians had an elaborate, almost theatrical relationship with grief and its material expression. But here is what often gets left out of the story. Hair jewellery was not only for the dead. A very significant portion of the hair jewellery made and exchanged in Victorian England was exchanged between living women, between close friends, as gifts, as pledges, as physical expressions of a bond that words alone felt insufficient to describe. Think about what this means for a moment. You take a piece of yourself, literally a part of your body, and you give it to another person to keep, to wear, to carry with them, and they do the same for you. There is something about that gesture that goes deeper than almost any words could reach. It says, "A part of me is always with you. Whatever separates us, distance, marriage, time, circumstance, this remains." The practice was rooted in very old traditions stretching back centuries, but it flourished in the Victorian era for reasons that were specific to that time and that world. One reason was practical. Photographs existed, but they were expensive and not yet widely accessible to ordinary families through most of the mid-Victorian period. A lock of hair was the most portable, most personal, most permanent physical image of a person that most people could actually obtain and keep. But the other reason was more interesting. The Victorians had a complex, almost mystical relationship with the human body and what it represented. There was a widespread belief, not always stated explicitly, but present throughout the culture, that a person's essence in some meaningful way resided in their physical being. That to possess a piece of someone's body was to possess a real connection to them, not merely a symbolic one. This belief expressed itself in mourning culture. It expressed itself in the popularity of death masks, and it expressed itself with particular tenderness in the hair jewellery exchanged between women who loved each other. Sharon Marcus, in her research on Victorian women's relationships, documented numerous examples of this practice in women's letters and diaries. Women wrote about giving hair to a friend with the same emotional register they used to write about declarations of affection. Women described receiving a friend's hair and keeping it in the most personal spaces of their lives in lockets, worn against the skin in small boxes kept in a bedside drawer, wound around a ring worn on the left hand. The left hand, the same hand on which wedding rings were worn. I do not think that was always accidental, but hair jewellery was only one piece of a much larger picture. Victorian women had an entire material culture of friendship, a whole range of objects and practices through which they expressed and sustained their bonds with each other. And the more you learn about it, the more it starts to look less like sentimental decoration and more like a deliberately constructed system. Consider the friendship album. Every respectable young Victorian woman owned one. It was a bound book, often beautifully covered, in which her friends and family members wrote entries, poems, quotations, sketches, pressed flowers, handwritten messages. Each entry was signed, dated, often decorated. The album was personal in the deepest sense. It was not for public display. It was kept privately read, privately added to over years and sometimes decades. Women brought their albums when they travelled. They asked new friends to contribute. They treasured the entries from old friends the way we might treasure old photographs as evidence that certain moments, certain connections had been real. What I find particularly striking about the friendship album is its structure. It was essentially a curated record of who had mattered to you. Every entry was a small act of documentation. This person was here in my life, and they left a mark. Women who grew up together, went to school together, moved apart as marriage scattered them across the country. They kept each other's handwriting in those albums for the rest of their lives. There is a collection of Victorian friendship albums held at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and if you ever have the chance to look through them, I recommend it unreservedly. Because what you find is not the stiff formality we associate with the era. What you find is warmth, humour, inside jokes, little drawings of inside references, the texture of actual friendship preserved across 150 years. Now I want to talk about something that surprises almost everyone when they first encounter it: the locket. Today we think of lockets as primarily romantic objects, something you give to a sweetheart, something that holds a tiny photograph of the person you love. And in Victorian England, yes, lockets were absolutely exchanged between romantic partners, but they were exchanged far more frequently between female friends. The numbers here are striking. When scholars have examined the surviving records of Victorian jewellery gifting shop records, diary entries, correspondence, they find consistently that the majority of lockets given and received by women in the mid-Victorian period were exchanged not with husbands or suitors, but with female friends and family members. Women gave each other lockets at significant moments when one was about to be married, and the friendship would inevitably change when one was moving away, when a long friendship reached what both women recognized as a new depth. The locket was a way of saying, carry me with you into whatever comes next. And inside those lockets, sometimes a miniature portrait, sometimes a lock of hair, sometimes both. And sometimes, and this detail genuinely moves me, a tiny folded piece of paper with a few words written on it. Words that only the recipient would ever read. We cannot know what most of those notes said. They have not survived, Or if they have, they are so private that archivists have left them unread out of respect. But we know they existed, we know women put them there, and we know that the women who wore those lockets carried them for decades sometimes until they died and were buried with them. Let me tell you about one specific example that I think captures everything we've been talking about. There were two women, one named Charlotte Cushman and one named Emma Stebbins, who lived in Rome together for many years in the mid-19th century. Charlotte Cushman was an American actress, one of the most celebrated performers on the English-speaking stage in the 1840s and 1850s. She was bold, unconventional, and deeply embedded in a circle of women artists and writers in Rome, who lived by the standards of their era extraordinarily free lives. Charlotte and Emma were partners in every meaningful sense of the word. They shared a home, shared finances, and were acknowledged by their social circle as a couple, though the word used, of course, was friends. Charlotte Cushman wore Emma's hair in a locket around her neck for the rest of her life. She also kept every letter Emma ever wrote her, organized them, preserved them, treated them with the kind of care you give to things you know will matter long after you're gone. When Charlotte died in 1876, Emma Stebbins was the one who prepared her biography for publication. She edited and shaped the public memory of the woman she had loved, making sure that even if the full truth of their relationship could not be named, the depth of their bond was legible to anyone paying attention. There is something incredibly moving about that. The idea that your closest person after you're gone is the one who gets to tell your story, that the person who knew you most fully is the one who shapes how the world remembers you. That is a kind of love that does not require a particular label to be recognized. Okay, I want to ask you something directly because I think about this a lot, and I am genuinely curious what you think. We live in an era of almost limitless communication. We can send a message to anyone in the world in seconds. We have photographs of everyone we love stored in our pockets. We have video calls and voice notes and shared playlists and all manner of ways to say I am thinking of you, you matter to me. And yet, do you have an object that carries a friend's presence? Do you have something physical, something you wear or keep or look at, that is specifically tied to a friendship rather than a romance or a family relationship? For most of us, the honest answer is probably no. Or maybe one thing, a specific piece of jewellery or a photograph, but not a whole culture of it. Victorian women had a whole culture of it. And I think that tells us something important, not that Victorian women were more sentimental, not that they were naive or excessive, but that they understood something very clearly. Love needs to be expressed in the physical world to stay alive. Connection needs anchors. Friendship left entirely in the realm of feeling and never made solid and visible tends to drift. They were not wrong about that. There is one more object I want to mention before we move forward, because it is the strangest and in some ways the most fascinating of all. Woven hair pictures, not jewellery, pictures. Actual framed artworks made entirely from human hair. These were displayed in homes, in parlors, in bedrooms, sometimes in quite prominent positions. They depicted landscapes, flower arrangements, even portraits. And they were made from the contributed hair of the household's family and close friends. Each person's hair would be a different colour, a slightly different texture. The picture was literally woven from the strands of the people who mattered most. I find this image almost unbearably poignant. A picture on your wall made from the hair of the people you love every single day, reminding you that your life is built from the lives of others, that you're not separate and individual but woven inextricably, physically, visibly into a web of connection. The Victorians, who are so often portrayed as cold and repressed and emotionally distant, were hanging that on their walls. What does that tell you? The objects themselves are only the surface of this story, though. Because what sustained Victorian female friendship in the long hours between visits, between gifts, between the physical presence of the other person, was something even more intimate. It was writing. The letters that these women wrote to each other are among the most extraordinary documents in English social history. And the language they used in those letters is going to surprise you. Because when Victorian women picked up their pens to write to their closest friends, the formal, corseted, carefully controlled voice of public Victorian womanhood disappeared entirely. What came out instead was something else. Something raw and honest and sometimes startlingly direct. And that is exactly where we're going next. Something I keep coming back to, and I think you will feel this too once I say it out loud, is how much we've been conditioned to believe that the Victorians were emotionally repressed, cold, formal, buttoned up, literally and figuratively. And then you read their letters, and the image just dissolves. Because the private correspondence of Victorian women is some of the most emotionally direct writing in the English language. Not flowery in an empty way, not performatively sentimental, but genuinely, sometimes shockingly open in a way that most of us would struggle to match today, even in our most vulnerable moments. Let me read you something. Not a famous quote from a famous person, just an ordinary letter written by an ordinary woman named Mary Hallock Foote to her closest friend Helena de Kay, sometime in the 1870s. Mary was a writer and illustrator. Helena was an artist. They had met as young women in New York, become inseparable, and then been separated by marriage and circumstance, Mary eventually moving west to the mining camps of the American frontier while Helena stayed in the east. Mary wrote to Helena, "I wanted so to put my arms around my girl of all the girls in the world and tell her, I love her as wives do love their husbands as friends who have taken each other for life." Read that again. As wives do love their husbands. This was not a secret letter. It was not hidden, not encoded, not written in the margins of a book where no one would find it. It was a regular piece of correspondence between two women who wrote to each other constantly, whose letters were kept and eventually archived, and whose friendship was considered by everyone who knew them to be one of the most admirable relationships in their social circle. Mary Hallock Foote was not being scandalous. She was being precise. She was reaching for the most accurate language she had available to describe what she felt, and the most accurate language she had was the language of marriage, because in her world marriage was supposed to be the deepest bond a person could form. And she was saying what Helena and I have is that, or more than that. The penny post changed everything. This is a detail that I think deserves more attention than it usually gets. In January of 1840, the British government introduced the uniform penny post, a system that for the first time in history allowed any letter weighing up to half an ounce to be sent anywhere in the United Kingdom for the price of 1 penny. 1 single penny regardless of distance. Before this, postage was expensive and complicated. Letters were charged by the number of sheets and the distance travelled, and the cost was typically paid by the recipient rather than the sender. Sending a letter to someone far away could cost the equivalent of a day's wages for a working person. Correspondence was a luxury. After January 1840 it was not. The effect was immediate and enormous. The volume of letters sent in the United Kingdom more than quadrupled within the first year of the penny post. Within a decade, the annual number of letters sent had increased by over 600%. For women's friendships, this was transformative in a way that is hard to overstate. Suddenly, the friend who had married and moved to Manchester or to Edinburgh or to a village in Wales, suddenly she was reachable. Not just reachable, but reachable every single day if you wanted. A letter sent in the morning could arrive the following day. Multiple deliveries happened daily in cities. Correspondence became for the first time something close to a conversation. And Victorian women used this with extraordinary enthusiasm. The scholar Carolyn Steedman, who has spent decades studying Victorian working-class life and correspondence notes, that letter writing became almost immediately democratized after 1840, that women across the class spectrum, not just the well-educated elite, began using letters to maintain intimate friendships across distance. The letters they wrote were not brief. They were not functional. They were not the Victorian equivalent of a quick text saying, "Everything is fine, how are you?" They were long, sometimes very long, 10 pages, 20 pages, written across several days, added to each morning, sealed and sent at the end of the week. They contained observations, reflections, confessions, humour, complaints, small detailed reports on the texture of daily life, what was eaten at dinner, what the light looked like that afternoon, what a neighbour had said that was either funny or infuriating or both. What strikes me about this, and I mean this as a genuine observation, not romanticisation, is that Victorian women were extraordinarily good at the thing we are increasingly bad at. They were good at the slow, sustained, patient work of staying close to someone across distance and time. We have more tools for connection than any generation in human history. We can reach anyone, anywhere, instantly. And yet study after study in recent years shows that rates of loneliness in the United States and across the Western world have been climbing steadily for decades. That people report having fewer close friends than previous generations. That the friendships people do have tend to be shallower and more easily dropped when life gets busy. Victorian women who had no telephone, no instant messaging, no social media, no ability to travel quickly or cheaply, somehow kept their closest friendships alive and nourishing across decades and across continents. They did it with paper and ink, and the discipline to sit down and write, not when they felt like it, not when something important had happened, but regularly, consistently, as a practice. Does that make you think at all about your own friendships, about the ones that have drifted not because anything went wrong, but just because life moved fast and you both got busy? I think about it. More than I probably should. But honestly, more than I probably did before I fell into this particular corner of history. Let us talk about the language itself, because this is where the story gets genuinely layered. The words Victorian women used in their letters to each other, the particular vocabulary of female friendship in the 19th century, has been the subject of serious historical debate for the past several decades. And the debate centres on a deceptively simple question. When a Victorian woman wrote to her closest friend and said, "I love you," what did she mean? This sounds like it should have a simple answer, but it does not. And the reason it does not is one of the most interesting problems in all of social history. The historian Carol Smith Rosenberg published a groundbreaking essay in 1975 called The Female World of Love and Ritual, which was based on her analysis of letters and diaries from American women between roughly 1820 and 1920. What she found was a consistent, pervasive pattern of intense emotional language between women, language that used words like love, devotion, longing, and darling without any apparent self-consciousness or sense that this required explanation. Smith-Rosenberg's argument was that this language existed within what she called a female world, a separate emotional sphere somewhat apart from the male world in which women's bonds with each other were the primary source of emotional sustenance. She argued that these relationships were not considered sexual by the women themselves or by their society, and that reading them through a modern lens risks projecting categories of identity onto people who would not have recognized those categories. Other historians pushed back. They pointed to specific cases, and there are many of them, as we'll discover later in this story, where the evidence of physical intimacy between women is not ambiguous, where the letters are explicit enough that no amount of historical context changes what they describe. And then a third group of historians, including Sharon Marcus, argued that the whole debate was somewhat beside the point, that the relevant question was not what label would we apply today, but rather what did these relationships mean in their own context, and that the answer to that question was, they meant everything. They were real, they were profound, and they existed across a spectrum that Victorian society did not need to categorize the way we do. I find myself drawn to that third position for what it is worth, not because I want to avoid the harder questions, but because I think the insistence on categorization can actually make us see less rather than more. When you approach these friendships with the goal of deciding whether they were really this or really that, you risk missing the simple, enormous fact of what they were some of the deepest human bonds ever documented. Let me tell you about Edith Simcox. Edith Simcox was a Victorian writer, labour activist and journalist, a genuinely remarkable woman who spent most of her adult life deeply, painfully, devotedly in love with the novelist Mary Ann Evans, who published under the name George Eliot. Edith kept a private journal which she called her autobiography of a shirt maker for most of her adult life. In it she documented her feelings for George Eliot with a candour that is almost difficult to read, not because it is inappropriate, but because it is so raw, so unguarded, so completely honest, in a way that people almost never are when they know others might one day read their words. She wrote about sitting at George Eliot's feet and kissing her hands. She wrote about her jealousy of George Eliot's husband, George Henry Lewis. She wrote about the particular quality of George Eliot's attention when they were alone together, the warmth of it, the intelligence of it, and the desolation of being without it. George Eliot was aware of Edith's feelings. She was gentle with them. She was also, from Edith's perspective, somewhat maddeningly composed about the whole situation, affectionate and warm and completely in control of the distance between them. What I find most remarkable about the Edith Simcox story is not the unrequited quality of it, though that is genuinely affecting, but the fact that she wrote it all down. She did not destroy the journal. She could have. Many people discovering journals like this after a death would have destroyed them. But Edith Simcox kept her journal, and eventually it survived, and it is now held in the Bodleian Library at Oxford University, and it has been studied by scholars for decades. She kept it, I think, because she believed her feelings were worth preserving, because she believed that the love she felt, even unrequited, even impossible, even without a name she could comfortably attach to it, was real enough to deserve a record. That belief in itself is a kind of statement, a statement about the legitimacy of what she felt. One more thing about these letters, and then I want to show you how the language itself reveals something much larger about Victorian social structure. Victorian women's letters had a grammar of escalation. Friendships did not just exist at a fixed emotional temperature, they moved. They deepened visibly and trackably through changes in the language used. You can actually trace the arc of a friendship across letters the way you might trace the development of a character across chapters of a novel. The early letters between new friends are warm but careful. They use the formal address, "Dear Miss Hartley," and they discuss safe topics, recent reading, a shared acquaintance, a social event. The prose is polished. The emotional register is pleasant. Then gradually the form loosens. The address shifts first to the given name, then sometimes to a nickname or a term of endearment. The topics get closer to the bone. The woman starts to mention things she admits she cannot say to anyone else. The handwriting sometimes changes faster, less careful, as if the words are coming more quickly than the pen can comfortably follow. And eventually in the letters between the closest friends, women who had known each other for years, who'd been through marriages and deaths and illnesses and moves together, the letters read like conversations with yourself. Private, unfiltered, complete. The literary historian Margaretta Jolly, who has studied women's correspondence extensively, describes this arc as the letter becoming a kind of portable intimacy, a space that belongs entirely to the friendship subject to its own rules, governed by its own particular language. That image, a portable intimacy, is one I have not been able to let go of since I first encountered it, because is that not exactly what a deep friendship is? A space you carry with you that exists between two specific people, and no one else with its own history and its own language and its own particular quality of understanding. Victorian women built those spaces deliberately, carefully, and with enormous skill. And they built them in part because they had to, because the spaces they were permitted to occupy in the larger world were so limited that the interior world of friendship became for many of them the primary territory of their lives. This is the part of the history that I think contains the most unexpected lesson. Because we tend to look at Victorian women and feel sorry for them, or at least to feel the comfortable distance of being glad we're not them. The restrictions were real. The inequality was real. The suffering those restrictions caused was real. But the interior life those same restrictions produced the depth of attention, the richness of feeling, the sheer quality of the connection that was also real. I'm not saying the cage was worth it. I'm absolutely not saying that. But I am saying that human beings given constraints have an extraordinary capacity to build beauty inside them, and that the friendships Victorian women built in their letters, in their visiting rituals, in their hair jewellery, and their friendship albums, and their carefully cultivated language of love, those were genuine achievements. Those were things worth preserving. Those were things worth knowing about. And now we're about to encounter something that will complicate this picture in the best possible way. Because so far we've been talking about female friendship as if it existed in a kind of social vacuum, as if it were equally available to all women, equally shaped by the same forces, equally expressed in the same vocabulary. But Victorian England was not a social vacuum. It was one of the most rigidly stratified societies in the Western world, and the rules that governed who could be friends with whom, the invisible but iron laws of class, of rank, of birth and money, and address those rules, were not applied equally to men and women. For women they were applied with a particular kind of precision that I think you are going to find fascinating. Because in Victorian England the hierarchy was not just a social fact. For women it was written into the very first moment of every friendship. It was written into who was introduced to whom, and whose permission was required to make the introduction at all. And that story, the story of how class-shaped female friendship, in ways both obvious and deeply hidden, that is exactly what we are exploring next. Here is a question that might seem simple at first. Who were your friends growing up? Think about it for a moment. Where did you meet them? School, most likely. Maybe the neighbourhood. Maybe a sports team or a club. And here is the thing, most of us, if we are being honest, made our first close friendships with people who lived near us, who were roughly the same age, who came from roughly the same kind of family. We call this natural. We call it organic. We do not usually think of it as a system. But it is a system. It has always been a system. And in Victorian England that system was not organic at all. It was engineered. Deliberately, meticulously, and with consequences that shaped the entire landscape of women's lives. The hierarchy that governed Victorian female friendship was not a background condition, it was the foreground. It was the first thing that determined whether a friendship was even possible, before warmth, before shared interests, before any of the things we think of as the actual ingredients of friendship. And understanding how it worked revealed something uncomfortable about the nature of female solidarity in one of history's most celebrated eras of feminine virtue. Let us start with a scene that would have been instantly recognizable to any Victorian woman regardless of her social position. A drawing room. London sometime in the 1860s. A hostess is preparing for an afternoon gathering, one of the small curated social events that were the engine of Victorian social life. She's standing with her husband going over the guest list, and they are making decisions about introductions. Who will be introduced to whom? In what order? With what phrasing? This was not a trivial conversation. The introduction was a social act with real stakes. To introduce someone was to vouch for them, to place your own social reputation alongside theirs, and say implicitly this person is worthy of your acquaintance. and the rules governing introductions were precise. The etiquette manuals of the period which women read with the kind of focus we reserve for instruction manuals for things that actually matter were unambiguous on this point. When introducing two women, the socially superior woman was always addressed first. The socially inferior woman was presented to her, not the other way around. The superior woman's permission implied or explicit was required before the introduction could proceed. This meant that every first meeting between two women who did not already know each other contained built into its very structure a declaration of rank. Someone was above, someone was below, and both of them knew it. The Victorian class system was by the middle of the 19th century considerably more complicated than the simple aristocracy and everyone else model that popular history tends to suggest. There was old aristocracy, the titled families, the great landowners, the people whose names appeared in Debrett's peerage. This group was small, enormously wealthy, and socially unassailable. Then there was the gentry landed families without titles, comfortable but not spectacular. They occupied a position of quiet respectability that was distinct from and considered superior to the rapidly expanding middle class. And then there was the middle class itself, which by the Victorian era had grown into something extraordinarily diverse and internally stratified. A wealthy manufacturer in Manchester and a struggling curate in a rural village were both technically middle class. The distance between them in terms of income, education expectations, and social access was enormous. Below all of this were the working classes, domestic servants, factory workers, agricultural labourers, the vast numbers of people whose labour made Victorian prosperity possible, and who were for purposes of polite society almost entirely invisible. Now, here is what this meant for female friendship specifically. For men, class operated through institutions, school, university, club, profession. A man's rank was to a significant degree legible from where he'd been educated and what he did for a living. These were not perfectly reliable indicators, but they were at least external and in principle verifiable. For women who had no university education through most of the Victorian period, no professions, no clubs, the legibility of class was almost entirely social. It was expressed through dress, through speech, through manner, through who called on whom, through the precise calibration of every greeting and every introduction. Women were in a very real sense the living embodiment of their family's class position, and female friendship was one of the primary mechanisms through which that position was maintained or threatened. A woman who befriended someone beneath her station was not just making a personal choice. She was making a statement about what her family stood for. She was potentially devaluing the social currency that her entire household depended on. This is not a comfortable thing to say about women who in other respects showed such profound capacity for genuine connection. But I think it has to be said because it is true and because understanding it is essential to understanding everything else. The finishing school is a good place to examine this in concrete detail because finishing schools were not just educational institutions, they were in their deepest function class sorting mechanisms. The finishing school as a formal institution became widespread in England and on the European continent, particularly in Switzerland and France, through the first half of the 19th century. By the 1850s and 60s, sending a daughter to a good finishing school was considered essentially mandatory for families with social aspirations. What did these schools teach? The curriculum broadly included modern languages, particularly French, which was the prestige language of upper-class Europe, music, drawing, dancing, deportment, and the social arts. How to enter a room, how to sit, how to manage conversation, how to preside over a table. These seem, from today's perspective, somewhat absurd as the primary subjects of a young woman's formal education. But their purpose was not absurd at all. Their purpose was to produce women who could function flawlessly at the highest levels of polite society. Women who could be confidently placed in any social situation and reflect credit on their families. And their secondary purpose, perhaps equally important, was to produce these women together. The friendships formed at finishing school were considered among the most socially valuable a woman could make. Not because the girls necessarily liked each other better than they liked anyone else, but because those friendships came pre-certified. A girl you had been at school with in Switzerland or in Bath had already been vetted, already placed on the same social tier already deemed appropriate. The finishing school friendship was in a sense a friendship that arrived with its social permission already granted. Let me tell you about a woman named Constance Lytton, because her story illuminates the class dynamics of Victorian female friendship in a way that is both specific and rather shattering. Constance Lytton was born in 1869 into an aristocratic family. Her father was Edward Robert Bulwer Lytton, the first Earl of Lytton, a poet and diplomat. She grew up in the rarefied world of Victorian high society country houses, London Season's carefully managed social networks in which every relationship was calibrated for a maximum advantage. Constance moved through this world with all the social ease her birth and education had equipped her for. Her friendships in early adulthood were largely with women of her own class, women she'd met through family connections, through the season, through the overlapping social networks of the aristocracy. And then in the early 1900s, Constance became involved in the women's suffrage movement, and everything changed. She began spending time with working-class women, with factory workers and seamstresses and women who had never attended any school at all, let alone a finishing school. Women whose speech marked them immediately as belonging to a world entirely different from Constance's own. And what she encountered was not just the practical challenges of cross-class organising. She encountered the internal friction of her own conditioning, the deep, almost physical discomfort of social equality with women she'd been trained from birth to see as occupying a different order of existence. Constance wrote about this with remarkable honesty in her memoir published in 1914. She described the effort it required, the active conscious work of dismantling assumptions she had not even known she held to see these women as equals, as people whose inner lives were as rich, whose friendships were as valid, whose feelings were as real as her own. It is a humbling account, and it is humbling precisely because Constance Lytton was by any measure a woman of unusual empathy and intelligence. If even she required that much effort to cross the class boundary in friendship, you begin to understand how nearly impermeable that boundary was for most Victorian women. The boundary operated in both directions, by the way, and this is a dimension of the story that is easy to miss if you are only paying attention to the top of the social hierarchy. Working-class women in Victorian England also had friendship cultures, also formed deep bonds, also developed their own rituals and languages of connection. But almost none of it has been studied with the same scholarly attention, because almost none of it was written down in ways that survived. Working-class women's friendships existed primarily in oral culture, in conversation, in shared labour, in the physical proximity of shared domestic space. They were real, they were important, and they are largely invisible to history. The historian Anna Clark, who has written extensively about working-class women in Victorian England, argues that this invisibility is not an accident. The history we have of Victorian female friendship is overwhelmingly the history of middle and upper-class female friendship, because those are the women who left letters, who kept diaries, whose papers were preserved in family archives and eventually donated to institutions. The working-class woman who spent 20 years as a close friend to her neighbour, who helped her through 6 childbirths and 2 bereavements, and one husband who drank too much, that friendship is gone. We know it happened. We cannot read it. I find this genuinely painful to contemplate. and I think it should make us careful about generalizing too freely from the evidence we do have. The story of Victorian female friendship that history gives us is a partial story, a class-biased story, one that reflects the friendships of women who had the leisure to write the education to write well and the social position to preserve what they wrote. The full story, the whole vast varied cross-class reality of how Victorian women loved and sustained each other is much larger than what survived. But there is one area where class boundaries in female friendship did occasionally bend, and it is fascinating precisely because of what it reveals about the conditions under which those boundaries could move. The relationship between a mistress and her lady's maid, or between a mistress and a trusted female servant more generally, was one of the few spaces in Victorian life where women of radically different social positions spent sustained intimate time together. A lady's maid was not just a servant in the functional sense. She was present for some of the most private moments of her mistress's life. She helped her dress and undress. She heard conversations that were not meant for public ears. She travelled with her mistress, sat with her when she was ill, sometimes accompanied her to events where the social gap between them was at its most visible and its most strange, and sometimes not always, not even usually, but sometimes something genuine developed in that space. The diaries of Victorian women occasionally record these relationships with a candour that suggests the writers themselves were somewhat surprised by what they felt. A mistress writing about her lady's maid with warmth, with worry, with a sense of connection that went beyond the purely practical. He sensed that this woman who served her in all the most literal ways also knew her in ways that no one else did. There is an extraordinary example in the diaries of Queen Victoria herself, who was among other things one of the most prolific diarists of the Victorian era. Victoria's relationship with her Highland servant John Brown has received enormous attention from historians for obvious reasons, but less attention has been paid to Victoria's relationships with her female attendants, relationships that her diaries reveal to have been at their best marked by genuine affection and something approaching real friendship. Victoria was not typical, obviously. She occupied a position so far above the ordinary class hierarchy that the rules that governed other women's friendships did not apply to her in the same way. But the emotional dynamic, the intimacy that can develop between women who spend concentrated time together in domestic space, across a social gap that in theory should prevent intimacy, that dynamic was not unique to her. Let me ask you something that I have been sitting with for a while now. We like to think of ourselves as less class-bound than the Victorians, more democratic, more open, more willing to form friendships across lines of social difference. And in some ways that is probably true. But I wonder sometimes whether the class dynamics that shaped Victorian female friendship have really disappeared, or whether they have just changed their form, whether the signals we use today, educational background, occupation, neighbourhood, the specific vocabulary we use and the cultural references we make, whether those signals are doing the same sorting work that the calling card and the finishing school and the introduction ritual did in 1860, whether we are really as free to befriend across social difference as we think we are, or whether the invisible architecture is still there, just dressed differently. I do not have a clean answer to that. But I think the Victorians, for all their visible and explicit social stratification, at least had the honesty of transparency. The rules were written down. Everyone knew what they were. The hierarchy was in its own way legible. Our version of the same dynamics tends to be less visible, and I am not sure that is entirely progress. All of this, the calling cards, the letters, the hair jewellery, the class hierarchies, the finishing schools, the rigid boundaries and the occasional astonishing crossing of them, all of it, is really just the structure. The skeleton of Victorian female friendship. What we have not yet fully explored is what happened when that structure was used not to contain friendship, but to protect something that the outside world had no category for, because there were Victorian women who took the permissions that their friendship culture offered, the shared beds, the passionate language, the long visits, the devoted correspondence, and used them to build something that was not, by any honest reckoning, simply friendship. Something that looked from the outside like the most intense version of what society allowed, and was on the inside something else entirely. The story of those women, how they lived, how they loved, and how they used the rules of Victorian society to carve out spaces that the rules were not designed to permit, is one of the most quietly extraordinary stories in all of women's history. And it begins with a school friendship in the north of England that changed the life of a woman who would one day own more land than almost any other woman in Yorkshire. Her name was Anne Lister, and she kept a diary. 4,966,000 words. That is the approximate length of Anne Lister's diary. To put that in perspective, the entire Harry Potter series, all 7 books combined, is roughly 1 million words. Anne Lister wrote nearly 5 times that amount, in longhand, over the course of about 25 years, while also managing a large estate, conducting business negotiations, travelling extensively across Europe, learning Greek and Latin for pleasure, and living what any honest reader would describe as an extraordinarily full life. And here is the part that makes this already remarkable document even more remarkable. Roughly 1/6 of those nearly 5 million words, around 650,000 words, were written in a private code. A code that she invented herself. A code that combined elements of Greek letters, mathematical symbols and punctuation marks into a cipher so complex and so personal that it took 2 scholars working in partnership, John Lister, who inherited the diaries in the late 19th century, and a local historian named John Murgatroyd, the better part of several decades to partially decode it. And even after their work, the full decipherment was not completed until the 20th century, when Helena Whitbread, a scholar from Yorkshire, spent years working through the encrypted passages and finally published them in full. The coded sections contained the most private parts of Anne Lister's life, and what they revealed when the cipher was finally broken was a woman who had lived with a completeness and a self-knowledge that the Victorian world around her was not remotely prepared to accommodate. Anne Lister was born in 1791 in Yorkshire, England, into a family of the minor gentry. She was not aristocracy, not titled, not fabulously wealthy, but she was landed, educated, and possessed of a social position that gave her certain freedoms that most women of her era could not access. She was from a young age what her contemporaries tactfully described as unusual. She dressed in black almost exclusively. Not mourning black, just black. Always. In an era when women's dress was expected to be decorative and colourful, Anne Lister's unvarying dark clothing made her immediately distinctive. People noticed, people commented. She did not particularly care. She walked everywhere, often alone, covering distances that were considered unsuitable for a woman 10 miles, 15 miles over rough moorland terrain in all weather. She managed her own business affairs with a directness that made male business partners visibly uncomfortable. She argued, she negotiated. She did not defer when she disagreed. The locals in and around Halifax, where she lived at Shibden Hall, a beautiful ancient property that she would eventually inherit and extensively renovate, called her Gentleman Jack. Not cruelly necessarily, but observationally. There was something about Anne Lister that did not fit the available categories, and Anne Lister knew it. She wrote about it with extraordinary clarity in her diary from a young age. She knew that what she felt for women, the specific nature of her feelings, the particular quality of her attraction, was not what society called friendship, even passionate friendship. She called it her nature. Her own word, her own, framing her own refusal to accept that what she felt was a deviation from some standard she should aspire to correct. That clarity, that early stubborn, deeply private certainty, is one of the things that makes reading her diary such a disorienting experience. You expect someone writing in the 18-teens and 1820s to be confused or anguished or buried in self-reproach. And Anne Lister was none of those things. She was matter-of-fact about herself in a way that feels startlingly contemporary. Her first serious relationship, the one that formed her understanding of what her life could contain, began when she was a student. Her name was Eliza Raine. She was a year younger than Annie, the daughter of a British doctor who'd worked in India, and she'd come to York to be educated. The two girls met at a school in York run by a woman named Mrs. Reed, and they became, in the language of the time, inseparable. What Anne felt for Eliza was documented in her diary with a precision that leaves very little ambiguity. She wrote about her feelings with the same analytical intelligence she brought to everything else, examining them, naming them, trying to understand their particular character. She also documented the consequences of those feelings on Eliza, which were ultimately devastating. Eliza Raine loved Anne with the kind of total commitment that has no room for ambiguity or reserve. When Anne eventually withdrew from the relationship, moved on in the way that people do when they're young, and the world is still opening in front of them, Eliza did not recover. She suffered what her contemporaries called a mental collapse, and she spent most of the rest of her life in a private asylum in York. Anna Lister grieved this. She wrote about it in her diary. She felt genuine responsibility, genuine sorrow, but she did not, from the evidence of those pages, feel that her nature itself was the problem. She felt that the world's inability to accommodate her nature was the problem, and she spent the next 30 years of her life working around that limitation with a combination of intelligence, discretion, and sheer force of will that is even now breathtaking to observe. Here is how she did it. Anne Lister understood with perfect clarity the social machinery we've been discussing in earlier parts of this story. She understood the calling card system, the visiting rituals, the language of passionate friendship, the permission that Victorian society granted to intense female bonds, and she used all of it. She used it as cover, yes, but cover is too small a word for what she actually constructed. What she built through decades of careful social navigation was a life, a real full-layered life in which her relationships with women were central, protected by the forms that society offered and sustained by a private world of extraordinary richness that existed alongside the public one. She learned to read the social landscape of female friendship with a precision that was almost clinical. She knew which women were available for the kind of relationship she sought. She knew which ones were simply passionate friends in the conventional sense, and which ones might be something more. She knew how to move a relationship along a particular path without ever doing anything that from the outside looked different from what any woman might do with a close friend. She was in her own way brilliant at it. Her diary records a series of relationships over the course of her adult life, some brief, some lasting years, each documented with meticulous detail. The women she loved were mostly from her own social class, educated and literate, living within the same framework of respectable Victorian femininity that Anne herself inhabited in her public life. Some of them understood exactly what they were entering. Some of them, reading the evidence generously, perhaps did not, or perhaps maintained a comfortable ambiguity that allowed them to participate without fully acknowledging what it meant. Anne Lister navigated all of this. She managed the complexity of it. She grieved when it went wrong and celebrated in the private pages of her coded diary when it went right. The great love of her life, the relationship that gives the whole story its most extraordinary chapter, came late. Her name was Anne Walker. Anne Walker was a neighbour and a gentlewoman quiet. Where Anne Lister was bold, uncertain, where Anne Lister was decisive, spiritually troubled in ways that Anne, with her robust self-acceptance, sometimes found difficult to fully understand. She was also by any account genuinely kind, genuinely warm, and genuinely in love with Anne Lister. They met properly in the early 1830s, though they had known of each other for years as neighbours. The courtship, and it was a courtship conducted entirely within the forms of respectable female friendship, invisible as such to the outside world, lasted several years. It involved visits and letters and walks and all the ordinary apparatus of Victorian female social life, all of it charged with a significance that only the two participants fully understood. In 1834, Anne Lister and Anne Walker took communion together at Holy Trinity Church in Goodramgate, York. They intended this as a form of marriage, not a legal marriage that was not possible, and Anne Lister knew it, but a solemn spiritual commitment made in a sacred space witnessed by God if not by the law. Anne recorded it in her diary with the same careful precision she brought to everything: the date, the church, the emotional register of the moment. And then Anne Walker moved into Shibden Hall. She lived there with Anne Lister for the rest of Anne's life. To the outside world they were close friends, companions, two gentlewomen sharing a household which was unremarkable and common, and attracted no particular comment. Inside that household they were partners. They shared finances. They travelled together across Europe. They managed the estate together. They were in every practical sense married. I want to pause here for a moment because I think this story deserves something more than just narrative momentum. Anne Lister and Anne Walker were not unique. They were in the scale of their documentation exceptional, because Anne's diary is one of the most detailed first-person accounts of a woman's inner life from that entire century. But the kind of life they built together was not without precedent, and it was not without parallel. We talked in an earlier part of this story about the phenomenon historians would later call the Boston marriage women, who chose to build their lives together, sharing homes and finances and futures in a relationship that society accommodated under the broad umbrella of passionate friendship. Anne Lister and Anne Walker were doing this decades before the term existed, and they were doing it in rural Yorkshire, not in the relatively progressive, intellectual circles of New England or London. They were doing it in the middle of exactly the kind of traditional hierarchical church-going English society that supposedly had no room for it, and yet they did it, for years. What does that tell us? It tells us that the space created by Victorian female friendship culture was larger than its architects intended. Society built the parlour as a cage, and the women who lived in it, some of them the most determined ones, the ones with enough courage and enough clarity, turned it into something else. Not freedom exactly, not the simple, unambiguous freedom of living openly and being recognised for who you were. Anne Lister never had that. She had the coded diary, the private commitment, the life that existed in two registers, simultaneously the public one that looked conventional, and the private one that was entirely her own. But it was a life, a full, rich, deeply human life, and she built it with the tools that were available to her. Here is something that I find almost unbearably poignant about Anne Lister specifically. She knew that her diary was important. She knew with the same clarity that characterized everything else about her that what she was recording had historical significance, that she was documenting something that had no other record, a life of the kind she lived from the inside, in the first person with all its texture and complexity intact. She did not destroy the diary. She left it. She left nearly 5 million words, the coded sections carefully preserved alongside the plain text, the whole vast document tucked into a secret compartment in Shibden Hall, where it stayed until after her death. What was she leaving it for? Who did she imagine would one day read it? I have thought about this a great deal, and I do not think she imagined a world like ours, a world where her diary would be published in full, studied by scholars, turned into a television series watched by millions of people who would recognize in her something of themselves. I think she left it as a record, a quiet, stubborn insistence on the reality of her own experience, a refusal to allow the coded sections to disappear, an act of trust that someone someday would have the patience and the will to decode what she had written and understand what it meant. She was right. It just took about 150 years. One more thing about Anne Lister, and then I want to broaden the picture again. In the years after her relationship with Anne Walker was established, Anne Lister became increasingly prominent in the local business and civic life of Yorkshire. She developed her estate's coal mines, modernised Shibden Hall, involved herself in local politics. She travelled to Russia, to Switzerland, to Spain, climbing mountains, with the same purposeful energy she brought to everything. She was by any measure a successful woman, respected if slightly eccentric in her community, known for her business acumen, her extensive travels, her formidable intelligence. The people of Halifax knew her as Gentleman Jack still. The nickname stuck. They could see that something about her was different. What most of them could not see, what most of them would not see perhaps by choice, was the full shape of that difference. Because Anne Lister, for all her private boldness, was also in public a master of the form, she played the game of Victorian female social life with enough surface compliance that the deeper reality of her life remained for most people invisible. The code protected her. The forms of female friendship protected her. The cultural permission for passionate bonds between women, permission that society had built in for its own reasons, and that Anna Lister repurposed entirely all of it, created just enough cover. It was imperfect cover. There were whispers. There were people who knew or suspected. The locals who called her Gentleman Jack were not entirely wrong about what they were observing. But whispers and suspicions were not the same as consequences, and Anne Lister lived her life. Now Anne Lister was exceptional in her courage, in her self-knowledge, and in her extraordinary talent for documentation. But the broader phenomenon she represents women using the forms of Victorian female friendship to build lives that exceeded what those forms were designed to contain was not exceptional at all. It was in fact about to become one of the defining features of the second half of the 19th century, because as the Victorian era moved into its later decades, something was shifting in the culture of female friendship, something that had always existed quietly in private in coded diaries, and in the carefully maintained ambiguity of passionate friendships, something was beginning to become more visible, and it was beginning to get name, not the name we might use today, not those words not yet, but a name nonetheless, an identity, a way of understanding what it meant to be a woman who chose above all other arrangements to build her life with another woman. They called it eventually a Boston marriage, and the story of how that arrangement moved from the private sphere to the almost public one, how it became briefly something that polite society not only tolerated but in certain circles actually admired, is one of the most fascinating chapters in this entire history, and that chapter is coming up right now. Picture two women sitting in a drawing room in Boston, Massachusetts. The year is 1884. Outside, the city is doing what Boston does, moving briskly, purposefully, with that particular New England energy that has no patience for sentiment or delay. Inside, the drawing room is warm and book-lined and quiet in the way that only rooms inhabited by two people who are entirely comfortable with each other can be quiet. One of the women is reading, the other is writing letters. They have lived together for 3 years now. They share this house on Charles Street. They share their finances, they attend the same social events, they are received everywhere as a unit. When invitations arrive, they arrive addressed to both of them. When friends come to call, they come to see both of them. Nobody calls this remarkable. Nobody calls it anything, actually. It simply is. Two women living together, building a life. The social vocabulary of the time has a term for this, not a clinical term, not a medical term, just a description. People call it a Boston marriage. And the two women sitting in that warm, book-lined drawing room, One of them is Annie Adams Field's widow literary hostess, one of the most influential women in American letters. The other is Sarah Orne Jewett, novelist, poet, one of the finest writers of regional fiction the 19th century produced. They will live together, travel together, work alongside each other and love each other for the next 29 years until Sarah Orne Jewett's death in 1909. And their story and the broader story of the Boston marriage as a social phenomenon is one of the most quietly revolutionary chapters in the entire history of female friendship. The term itself is worth spending a moment on because its origins are genuinely interesting. Henry James, the novelist, the great anatomist of social life in both England and America, published a novel in 1886 called The Bostonians. It centers on a relationship between two women, Olive Chancellor, a wealthy Boston reformer, and Verena Tarrant, a young woman with a gift for public speaking. The bond between them is the emotional core of the book. It is intense, exclusive, and described with a psychological precision that makes it feel modern in a way that much Victorian fiction does not. James himself never used the phrase Boston marriage, but his novel gave a name, or at least a geographical association, to an arrangement that had existed well before his book and would continue well after it. Two women choosing each other above all other arrangements, building a shared domestic life being received by their social world as a recognized unit. The arrangement was not universal. It was not even common in the statistical sense. Most Victorian women obviously married men and built their lives within the framework of conventional marriage. But the Boston marriage was not marginal either. It was visible enough to have a name, visible enough to be the subject of a major novel, visible enough that educated people on both sides of the Atlantic knew what you meant when you referred to it. And here is what I find most extraordinary about it. For a substantial period, roughly the 1860s through the early 1900s, the Boston marriage was socially acceptable, not just tolerated, not just overlooked, actually accepted in certain circles as a legitimate way for women to organize their lives. How did that happen, and why eventually did it stop? The acceptance had everything to do with what the Boston marriage looked like from the outside. On the surface, it was indistinguishable from the deep domestic, mutually devoted female friendship that Victorian society had been encouraging for decades. Two women living together, sharing a household, devoting themselves to each other's well-being. This was simply the most complete, most sustained expression of everything that the friendship culture we have been exploring was already doing. The women who lived in Boston marriages were in most cases women of education and some independence. They were often involved in reform movements, abolition, temperance, suffrage. They were writers, artists, educators, social activists. Their domestic arrangements were frequently embedded in a broader context of purposeful public life, and this mattered for how they were perceived. A woman who lived with her closest female companion and spent her time writing novels, running a literary salon, and supporting charitable causes, she was not threatening. She was admirable. She was in some respects the ideal Victorian woman, the angel in the house, taken to its logical conclusion, completely devoted, completely domestic, completely absorbed in the care of another person. The fact that the person she was devoted to was another woman rather than a husband was for most of their social world simply a detail. Let me tell you more about Annie Fields and Sarah Orne Jewett, because their relationship is documented in enough detail to give us real texture. Annie Fields had been, before James Fields died in 1881, one of the great literary hostesses of Boston. Her home on Charles Street was a salon in the truest sense, a gathering place for the most significant writers, thinkers and artists of the American 19th century. Longfellow came there, Oliver Wendell Holmes came there, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Ralph Waldo Emerson. The list reads like the table of contents of an American literature anthology. Annie was not simply a hostess in the passive sense. She was a reader, a judge of talent, a woman whose literary opinions were taken seriously by the writers who sought them. She'd been instrumental in her husband's publishing decisions. She had discovered and promoted writers whose reputation she helped build. When James Fields died, Annie was 50. The salon continued, but the life that had organised itself around her husband's career now needed a new centre of gravity. She found it in Sarah Orne Jewett. Sarah was 14 years younger than Annie already, a published and admired writer, when their friendship deepened into something more. She had grown up in South Berwick, Maine, the daughter of a country doctor, and her writing was rooted in that landscape, the rocky coast, the small communities, the particular quality of life in rural New England. Her most celebrated work, The Country of the Pointed Firs, published in 1896, is still considered one of the masterpieces of American regional writing. What Sarah brought to Annie was not replacement. James Fields could not be replaced, and Annie would not have wanted him to be. What Sarah brought was a different kind of completeness, a friendship that became a partnership, that became the organising structure of Annie's later life. They travelled to England together, where they moved in literary circles and were received exactly as they presented themselves as a devoted pair. They spent summers in South Berwick at Sarah's family home. They wintered in Boston. They worked. They read together. They supported each other's writing. Annie kept every letter Sarah ever wrote her. After Sarah's death, Annie worked to preserve her friend's literary legacy with the same dedicated attention that Charlotte Cushman's partner had brought to Charlotte's memory a generation earlier. There is a pattern here that I want to name because I think it is significant. In story after story of women who lived in these deep partnerships, whether in England or in America, whether in the 18th century or the 19th, one of the recurring elements is that the surviving partner becomes the keeper of the other woman's memory. She edits the letters. She writes the memoir. She decides what the public record will contain. She becomes in death as in life the person most responsible for the other woman's place in history. This is a form of love that does not get talked about enough. We tend to think of love as something that exists primarily in the present tense, in the daily texture of a shared life, in the emotional warmth of being together. But the love expressed by these women for each other after death, the meticulous years-long work of preservation and remembrance that is also love, a love that asks nothing in return because there is no one left to return anything. It is in its way the most purely generous kind. Not everyone who entered a Boston marriage was in the modern sense of the word living what we might now consider a romantic partnership. And here the history becomes genuinely complicated in ways that I think are worth sitting with, rather than resolving too quickly. Some women who shared their lives with female companions did so for practical reasons: financial security, shared household costs, companionship in old age, without what we might now call a romantic dimension. Some were deeply in love with each other in ways that were entirely clear to both of them. Some occupied ambiguous middle territories that their own language could not fully articulate. The historian Lillian Faderman, who has written extensively about women's relationships in this period, argues that it is essentially impossible, and perhaps not even the right question, to try to determine case by case whether any given Boston marriage was or was not in the romantic sense what we might today call a same-sex partnership. The women themselves, she observes, often did not draw the line where we would draw it. The categories were simply different. What is clear is that these women chose each other, deliberately, consciously, often at some cost, in a world that offered them the alternative of conventional marriage and all the social rewards that came with it. They made a different choice, and they were not ashamed of that choice. That, to me, is the most remarkable part. Think about what social bravery this actually required. A woman who chose a Boston marriage was implicitly declining conventional marriage. In Victorian society, marriage was not simply a personal arrangement. It was the primary social institution through which respectable womanhood was expressed. To remain unmarried was to occupy a slightly awkward social position. The spinster, the old maid categories carrying at least a faint whiff of failure, a woman who remained unmarried because she had devoted herself to a female companion, was navigating this social pressure, while also building something genuinely different. She was saying by her actions, if not in words, I have found what I need, and it does not look like what society told me it should look like. In a world where that statement could not be made directly, where there was no language for it and no legal framework to support it, making it through the facts of one's daily life required a particular kind of quiet courage, and the women who did it by and large did not experience it as martyrdom. They experienced it as life. Let me ask you something that I think about a lot. We live in an era where the relationships these women had, the choices they made, the lives they built together, can be named and celebrated and legally recognized in ways that were simply not available to them. And that is genuinely straightforwardly good. But I wonder sometimes whether something was also lost in the translation. The Boston marriage existed within a culture that had a rich, warm, socially sanctioned vocabulary for deep female bonds, a vocabulary that did not require any particular identity claim to use. You could be a woman who loved another woman with your whole heart and build your entire life around that love without having to locate yourself within any category at all. You were simply a woman with a devoted friend. And the friendship itself, the form of it, the dailiness of it, the way it was received and recognized and celebrated by your social world, all of that was available to you without negotiation. I am not being nostalgic for the constraints. I am not saying the closet was comfortable. But I do think there is something worth noticing in the way that the Victorian friendship culture created a kind of warmth, a social porosity around female bonds that we have not entirely replaced with anything equivalent. The Boston marriage began to fade as the 19th century turned into the 20th. The reasons for this are interesting and somewhat ironic. As the late Victorian period produced increasingly sophisticated medical and psychological theories about human sexuality, as figures like Richard von Krafft-Ebing and later Sigmund Freud began to systematize and categorize the varieties of human desire, the expansive, ambiguous space that had sheltered female friendship began to contract. Suddenly, intense female bonds were not simply friendship. They were something to be examined, categorized, named. And for the first time, the women who lived in Boston marriages began to be seen not as devoted companions, but as something more specific, more clinical, more unsettling to the social order. The very visibility that had made the Boston marriage accepted its surface resemblance to conventional female devotion became a liability once the cultural gaze sharpened. Once people had a framework for seeing it differently, they could not unsee it. And the warm, socially sanctioned space that Anne Lister had navigated, that Annie Fields and Sarah Orne Jewett had inhabited, that hundreds of less famous women across 2 continents had quietly called home, that space began to close. It was take another century before it began to open again. But here is the thing about that closing. It did not stop the women who needed those bonds from forming them. It just made the bonds less visible, more private, more isolated from the social validation that had for a brief and rather extraordinary period surrounded them. The grief of that, the loss of that particular kind of social warmth, is something that the women who lived through that transition wrote about, though not always in terms we can easily recognize. And grief, as it turns out, is where the next chapter of this story lives. Because there is a particular grief in Victorian female friendship that we have not yet talked about. A grief that was not about the loss of a partner or the death of a companion. It was the grief of watching your closest friend, your intimate, your confidant, the person who knew your inner life more completely than anyone else, walk down an aisle and become someone's wife. That grief had no name in Victorian England, but it was everywhere, and the women who felt it wrote about it with a rawness that I think is going to stop you in your tracks. There is a kind of grief that does not get a funeral. No flowers, no condolences, no black dress, no mourning period, no socially recognized moment where the people around you understand that something has ended and give you space to feel it. It is the grief of a friendship that does not die. It just transforms slowly and irrevocably into something smaller than what it was. Something that fits inside the new life your friend has built with someone else. Something that visits on Tuesdays, writes letters on Sundays, and no longer fills the whole room the way it once did. Victorian women knew this grief intimately, and what is remarkable, genuinely remarkable when you read the evidence, is how clearly they named it to each other, even without having a name for it at all. Let us start with a scene that was so common in Victorian England that it barely registered as unusual to anyone living through it. A young woman, educated middle class somewhere in her early 20s, has a best friend. They have been close since school or since childhood, or since the particular intensity of young womanhood drew them together in the way it does. They write to each other constantly. They visit for weeks at a time. They are in the language of their world devoted to each other, and then the friend gets engaged. This was not a surprise exactly. Marriage was the expected trajectory. Every family anticipated it, planned for it, prepared for it. The season existed precisely to facilitate it. The etiquette of courtship, the rituals of engagement and wedding, all of it, was the machinery of a society organized around the institution of marriage as its primary social unit. But knowing something is coming does not make it painless when it arrives. What the letters and diaries of Victorian women record again and again is a very specific emotional experience at this moment. Not simple happiness for the friend, though that was there too, of course. Not simple jealousy of the fiancé, though that sometimes surfaced acknowledged or not. Something more complicated. Something that the women writing about it reached for various words to describe, and none of the words quite fit. One woman writing in her diary in 1857 described it as a feeling of having been, she used this exact phrase, quietly set aside. Not rejected, not abandoned, just repositioned. Moved from the centre of someone's life to its periphery, not by any unkindness, but by the simple gravitational force of a new and larger commitment. That phrase has stayed with me, quietly set aside. The historian Jill Rappaport, whose work on Victorian women's relationships and social bonds is some of the most nuanced in the field, has written about what she calls the marriage disruption in Victorian female friendship. Her argument, grounded in extensive reading of women's letters and diaries from the period, is that the marriage of a close friend represented one of the most significant emotional events in a Victorian woman's life, often more disorienting in immediate terms than her own marriage. This seems counterintuitive at first. Surely a woman's own marriage was the bigger event, but Rappaport's point is subtler than that. A woman's own marriage, however complex its emotional dimensions, came with a complete social script. There was a role to inhabit, a set of expectations to meet, a new identity to grow into. The culture had prepared her for it in every finishing school lesson, an etiquette manual chapter and maternal piece of advice. For the grief of losing a best friend to marriage, there was no script. There was no language, no ritual, no recognized period of adjustment. The woman who felt hollowed out by her closest friend's new life had no socially legitimate way to express that hollowness. She was expected instead to be gracious, to be pleased, to maintain the friendship in its new reduced form and pretend that the reduction was not a loss. Most Victorian women were very good at this. The maintenance of surface equanimity in the face of private feeling was after all one of the core skills their entire upbringing had trained them for. But the letters they wrote to each other, the real ones, the honest ones, the ones written late at night in handwriting, that get slightly less careful as the pages go on. Those letters tell the truth. Emily Dickinson wrote to Susan Gilbert, the woman who would eventually become her sister-in-law by marrying Emily's brother Austin for decades. Their correspondence is one of the most studied and debated bodies of letters in American literary history, partly because of its extraordinary emotional intensity, and partly because of the unresolved question of exactly what that intensity represents. But there is one specific period in the correspondence that I want to focus on, because it illustrates the grief we're talking about with unusual clarity. In the early 1850s, before Susan Gilbert's engagement to Austin Dickinson, Emily's letters to her are remarkable for their fullness. They are long-searching, poetic in their prose. They discuss books, ideas, feelings, the texture of daily life at the Dickinson family home in Amherst. They address Susan with a directness and an intimacy that Emily rarely deployed in any other correspondence. And then Susan's engagement is announced. The letters do not stop. The warmth does not disappear. Emily was genuinely fond of her brother and genuinely happy for Susan's security and social future. But something changes in the register of the correspondence. Something tightens. The letters become in places a little more careful, as if Emily is writing now with an awareness of a third presence, the new relationship, that will inevitably reshape her claim on Susan's attention. In one letter from this period, Emily writes to Susan, "I have but one thought, Susie, morning, noon and evening, and oh, that thought is you." Read in isolation, that sentence sounds like the apex of devotion. Read in context, read knowing what was happening in both their lives at that moment, it sounds like something else. It sounds like a woman trying with the only language available to her to hold on to something she can already feel beginning to slip. Susan Gilbert married Austin Dickinson in July of 1856. Emily Dickinson never married anyone. She continued writing to Susan for the rest of her life. The correspondence, over 300 letters and poems, more than Emily sent to any other single person, is the longest sustained correspondence of Emily Dickinson's life. Whether that continuation was consolation, or its own kind of grief, or both simultaneously, is something each reader has to decide for themselves. There is a passage in a novel that I think captures this emotional territory better than almost any historical document, partly because fiction has always had access to interior states that letters, even honest ones, tend to guard against. The novel is Middlemarch by George Eliot, published in 1871 and 1872. It is by general consensus one of the greatest novels in the English language, and it is full of acutely observed female relationships. But there is a moment near the beginning of the novel that I always return to. Dorothea Brooke, the novel's central character, has just become engaged to Edward Casaubon, a choice that everyone around her considers to varying degrees incomprehensible. He is old, dry, intellectually consumed, entirely unsuited to the passionate young woman proposing to marry him, and her closest companion, her sister Celia, says almost nothing. She tries gently, she hints, but she does not say what she actually feels, which is, "You are about to go somewhere I cannot follow, and I do not know how to stop you." George Eliot was writing about sisterhood specifically, but the emotional dynamic she was capturing was one that her Victorian readership recognized immediately from their own friendships. The feeling of watching someone you love make a choice that will take them away from you. The particular paralysis of caring deeply about someone who is moving into a life that does not have room for the fullness of what you were to each other. Eliot knew this dynamic from the inside. She had watched it in her own life, had observed it in the lives of women she knew, had written about it in her private correspondence years before she put it into fiction. She gave it no resolution in the novel, because in life it rarely has one. Now here is where the story gets more complicated and more interesting. The grief of a friend's marriage was not just about emotional loss. It had practical dimensions that Victorian society mostly refused to acknowledge, and those practical dimensions made the loss sharper and more lasting than simple sentimental attachment might explain. Think about what marriage meant structurally for a Victorian woman's friendship. Before her marriage, a woman lived if she was middle or upper class in her family's household. Her time was largely her own within that household's rhythms. She could write long letters in the morning, receive and pay afternoon calls, spend evenings with friends, devote whole weeks to visiting and being visited. After marriage, she entered her husband's household. Her time was now organized around his needs, his schedule, his preferences, his social obligations. She had domestic responsibilities that were real and demanding. She had typically, within a few years, children whose needs were constant and non-negotiable. The long visits that had been the lifeblood of female friendship, the weeks spent sharing a house, sleeping in the same room, talking for hours. In the easy intimacy of domestic proximity, those became much harder to arrange. A married woman with children and household responsibilities could not simply go and stay with a friend for 3 weeks the way an unmarried young woman could. The letters continued. But letters, as we have already discussed, are a reduction. They compress and flatten the texture of a friendship into what can be captured in writing, which is never quite everything. What I find most striking reading the historical record is how clearly Victorian women understood this dynamic, even as they were living through it. They were not naive about what marriage would cost them in terms of their female friendships. They wrote about it explicitly often before the wedding in terms that suggest they had thought carefully about the shape of the life they were entering. One woman, writing to her closest friend on the eve of her own wedding in 1863, put it with a clarity that takes your breath away a little. "I know that tomorrow I step into a world where you cannot entirely follow me. I know that what we have been to each other cannot remain exactly as it has been. I am not pretending otherwise. But I want you to know that whatever changes, whatever distances open between us, you are the one who has known me most truly, and nothing that comes after can undo that." That letter survived because the friend kept it for the rest of her life. She kept it folded inside a small book that was found among her personal effects when she died 40 years later. The book was a collection of poems she and the letter writer had read together as young women. Let me tell you about a slightly different angle on this grief one that comes from the etiquette manuals themselves and that I find fascinatingly revealing. The etiquette manuals of the Victorian period devoted considerable attention to the duties of friendship around the time of a wedding. What was expected of a close friend when her companion became engaged? What was the correct emotional register? What were the obligations? And what they prescribed in their careful, formal, advice-giving way tells you everything about what they were trying to manage. The manuals insisted repeatedly, and with what feels like a slightly anxious emphasis, that a true friend rejoiced purely and without reservation at her companion's engagement, that any hint of reluctance or sadness was a failure of genuine friendship, that the proper response was immediate, wholehearted celebration. The vehemence of this instruction, I think, tells us that the opposite was common enough to require managing. You do not write etiquette rules about things that people are already naturally inclined to do. You write etiquette rules about things people find difficult. The fact that the manuals felt it necessary to instruct women specifically on how to feel about a friend's wedding suggests that the complicated grief-adjacent feelings we have been discussing were in fact widespread. Victorian etiquette was in this, as in so many things, not describing behaviour. It was prescribing it, trying to shape the inner life into the form that society required. Whether it succeeded is a different question entirely. There is one more dimension of this grief that I want to name before we move on, because I think it is the most hidden and the most human. A significant part of the grief that Victorian women felt when their closest friends married was not purely about the loss of the friendship. It was about the loss of a certain version of themselves. In their female friendships, Victorian women were permitted to be more fully themselves than almost anywhere else in their lives. They could be funny, sharp, ambitious, intellectually engaged, emotionally expressive, opinionated, occasionally difficult. The friendship was the space where the performing of femininity relaxed and the actual person showed up. When the friendship changed, when it was compressed by the demands of marriage and motherhood, and the management of a household that permission narrowed too, the woman who'd been known in her fullness became to some degree known in her role: wife, mother, mistress of the house. The identity that Victorian society required her to inhabit began to take up more of the available space, and the self that had existed so vividly in the friendship began to have fewer occasions to breathe. This is not unique to the Victorian era. People in every time and place have experienced something like this, the way that the full self of young friendship gets gradually replaced by the partial self of adult responsibility. But in Victorian England, the compression was sharper because the roles were more total. Marriage did not just change your schedule, it changed your legal identity. Before the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882, a married woman in England had no legal existence separate from her husband. Her property became his. Her earnings became his. She became, in the eyes of the law, a subset of another person. To lose your closest friend to marriage was in some ways to lose her twice. Once to the emotional reorganization that a new primary attachment requires, and once to the legal and social transformation that turned her from an autonomous person into someone's wife. The women who grieved this understood both dimensions. They did not always have words for both, but you can feel both in their letters, in the careful honesty of what they allowed themselves to write. Does any of this feel familiar to you? I ask that genuinely, not rhetorically. Because I think this particular grief, the grief of a friendship that changes shape, when one person's life makes a major turn, is one of the most universal human experiences and also one of the least acknowledged. We talk about romantic heartbreak constantly. We have songs and films and entire cultural industries devoted to it. We give it space and language and social permission. The grief of a friendship that quietly, painlessly, without anyone being at fault, becomes less than what it was that grief mostly sits in silence. Victorian women sat with it too, but at least they wrote to each other about it. At least they named it to each other in the privacy of their correspondence with the kind of honesty that the formal social world would not accommodate. There is something I want to hold on to about that. The insistence on naming the thing even when there is no public language for it. The refusal to pretend that the loss is not a loss. But here is the turn in the story that I did not expect when I first started spending time in this history. The grief was real. The loss was real. And yet, and this is the part that genuinely surprised me, many Victorian female friendships survived the marriage of one partner. Not unchanged, not in the same form, but alive, sustained, meaningful over decades. How? Why? The answer has to do with something that Victorian women understood about the nature of love that I think we have in our era of romantic primacy, somewhat forgotten. They understood that love is not a competition, that the deepening of one bond does not require the extinction of another, that the woman who became a wife and mother could still be to her oldest and closest friend the person who had known her first and most truly. That friendship and marriage were not rivals. They were different kinds of love existing in different registers, meeting different needs. The women who maintained their female friendships across the disruption of marriage did so by insisting on this, by refusing to accept that the new relationship erased the old one. by continuing to show up in letters, in visits, in the small, consistent gestures of sustained attention, long after the social pressure to prioritize the marital bond above all others had made itself felt, and the friendships that survived that insistence became over time something remarkable. They became the deepest testimony of what these women's inner lives had actually contained. All of this, the grief, the disruption, the survival, the long-sustained work of keeping a friendship alive across the changes that life brings, was happening in the private sphere, in letters and diaries and the small domestic spaces of Victorian womanhood. But outside the private sphere, something was building. A movement, a collective anger, a gathering of women who had decided that the legal structures that turned them into subsets of their husbands, that stripped them of property and earnings and votes and voices, were not natural and were not acceptable. And the fuel for that movement, the emotional energy that powered it, the trust networks that held it together, the courage that sustained it when the opposition was fierce and the progress was slow, that fuel came to a significant degree from exactly the kind of female bonds we've been exploring all evening. The suffrage movement was not just a political movement, it was a friendship movement, and the story of how those two things became one, how the intimacies of Victorian female friendship became the infrastructure of a revolution, is where we are going next. Millicent Garrett Fawcett once said something that I have been thinking about since I first encountered it years before I started diving into this particular corner of history. She said, "Courage calls to courage everywhere. 4 words, or 5 depending on how you count. Simple enough to write on a scrap of paper, simple enough to say in under 2 seconds. And yet as a description of how social movements actually work, how the courage of one person reaches across space and time and calls something awake in another person who needed permission to feel it, I have not found anything that captures it more precisely. Victorian women's suffrage did not emerge from nowhere. It did not materialize because a few exceptional individuals had exceptional ideas. It emerged from a dense, decades-long web of female relationships, friendships, partnerships, mentorships, correspondences, drawing room conversations, late-night debates that had been quietly building its infrastructure long before anyone had the words for what they were building. The suffrage movement was at its root a friendship movement. And tonight we're going to follow the threads. Let us start in a place that might surprise you. Not with a rally, not with a petition, not with any of the formal visible acts of political organizing that history tends to record. Let us start with a parlor. Specifically, the parlor of a woman named Barbara Lee Smith, later known as Barbara Bodichon in London in the early 1850s. Barbara Bodichon was by any measure a remarkable person. She was an artist, an educator, a writer, and one of the most energetic social reformers of the Victorian era. She was also, and this is the part that matters for our story, an extraordinary builder of female networks. She had a gift for bringing women together, for creating the conditions in which women who had never met discovered that they were thinking about the same problems, feeling the same frustrations, and had been doing so in isolation when they could have been doing so together. In 1854, Barbara gathered a group of women at her home to discuss what she was calling the women question, the broad, encompassing question of what women's legal and social status actually was and whether it was acceptable. The women who came to that gathering were not a random collection. They were connected to each other through exactly the friendship networks we've been exploring, through shared schools, through family connections, through the correspondence chains that linked educated Victorian women across distances. Several of them had been friends since childhood. Others had been corresponding for years before they met in person. What that gathering produced was, among other things, a document called A Brief Summary in Plain Language of the Most Important Laws Concerning Women, written by Barbara Bodichon herself and published in 1854. It was one of the earliest systematic analyses of the legal disadvantages women faced under British law, written in deliberately accessible language specifically designed to be understood by women who were not lawyers and had no reason to have ever studied the law before. It was read by thousands of women, and it was passed from hand to hand through the friendship networks that already existed, the way genuinely important things have always travelled personally with a note, with a recommendation, with someone saying, "You need to read this." The link between female friendship and political organisation in the Victorian era was not accidental, and it was not simply sentimental. It was structural. Women in the 19th century did not have access to the institutional structures that allowed men to build political movements. They could not form professional associations in most fields. They could not attend university alongside men where the friendships that created lifelong political alliances were forged. They could not join the clubs and societies that served as the organisational backbone of male civic life. What they had was the social world we have been exploring all evening. The visiting networks, the correspondence chains, the drawing room gatherings, the deep personal loyalties that Victorian female friendship produced. And they used all of it. When the Married Women's Property Committee was formed in 1855, one of the earliest organised campaigns for legal reform on behalf of women, it organised itself primarily through existing female friendship networks. The committee's founders, including Barbara Bodichon and Bessie Rayner Parkes, were close personal friends who'd been corresponding for years. They recruited supporters by reaching out personally through those same networks to women they knew and trusted. Within months, they had collected approximately 26,000 signatures on a petition presented to Parliament. 26,000. At a time when organised political campaigning by women was essentially unprecedented, when there was no infrastructure for it, when there was no model to follow. They achieved that number because they had something more powerful than infrastructure. They had trust, the deeply personal, carefully cultivated trust of women who had been showing up for each other in letters and visits and long conversations for years before anyone called it politics. I want to tell you about two women whose friendship sits at the very centre of this story. Millicent Garrett Fawcett and Elizabeth Garrett Anderson were sisters. They grew up in Suffolk in a family of 10 children, raised by parents who were unusually for the time genuinely committed to their daughters' intellectual development. Their father, Newson Garrett, believed that his daughters deserved the same educational and professional opportunities as his sons. This was not a common position for a Victorian father to hold. It was a gift that shaped both women's entire lives. Elizabeth became the first woman to qualify as a physician in Britain in 1865, after fighting a years-long battle against the medical establishment that would have been impossible without both her own extraordinary determination and the network of female supporters who sustained her through it. Millicent became one of the leaders of the constitutional wing of the suffrage movement, the wing that advocated for women's votes through legal and parliamentary means rather than direct action. She led the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies for 21 years from 1897 to 1918. But what I want to focus on is not their individual achievements, remarkable as those were. I want to focus on the friendship between them, because Millicent and Elizabeth's relationship was not simply a sisterly bond. It was a working partnership, an intellectual alliance, a mutual support system that sustained both of them through the particular grinding difficulty of being a woman who wants something that her society has decided she cannot have. They wrote to each other constantly. They consulted each other on strategy. When one was discouraged, and there were plenty of occasions for discouragement, the campaign for women's suffrage in Britain lasted over 70 years, the other provided the steadiness that made continuing possible. This dynamic repeated itself throughout the suffrage movement. Pairs and small groups of women connected through friendship, sustaining each other through the long, slow work of changing something that powerful people were determined not to change. The drawing room, which we talked about in an earlier part of this story as the primary social space of Victorian female life, became in the second half of the 19th century something more than a venue for morning calls and friendship rituals. It became a political space. This transformation was subtle enough that it could maintain a certain deniability. A conversation about women's legal status could begin as a social call and end as a planning meeting without ever formally crossing the line into the kind of organised political activity that made Victorian authorities nervous. Women learned to use the forms of their social world, the tea, the calling cards, the careful seating arrangements, the established patterns of who could speak and when, as cover for conversations that those forms were never designed to contain. Frances Power, Cobb, was one of the most visible examples of this. Cobb was a Victorian writer, journalist and activist who produced an extraordinary volume of work on women's rights, animal welfare and social reform over a career spanning several decades. She was also for many years in a committed partnership with a sculptor named Mary Lloyd, a Boston marriage in everything but geography. Her drawing room in London was famous. People came from across the city, across the country sometimes to attend her gatherings. The conversations that happened there were wide-ranging, intellectually serious and deeply connected to the reform movements Cobb cared about. She was by the standards of any era a formidable networker. She knew everyone connected everyone and used those connections with the precision of someone who understood that social capital was real capital. What is less often emphasized about Cobb is how much her capacity to do all of this depended on her partnership with Mary Lloyd. The stability of that domestic life, the shared home, the practical support, the emotional grounding of having someone who was genuinely on your side, freed Cobb to do the public work she did with a consistency and a focus that would have been much harder to sustain in a more isolated life. Her partnership was in a very direct sense her political infrastructure. Now I want to raise something that I think the history of women's suffrage does not discuss enough, because it is uncomfortable but important. The friendship networks that powered Victorian women's political organising were like the friendship culture we explored earlier, shaped by class. The women who organised, who petitioned, who hosted drawing room gatherings, who had the time and education to write pamphlets and attend committee meetings, these were overwhelmingly middle and upper class women. The Married Women's Property Act that Barbara Bodichon helped campaign for was in its most immediate effect most important for women who had property in the first place. The vote, when it was eventually won, was won initially only for women over 30 who met a property qualification, a restriction that excluded most working-class women. This is not a reason to dismiss the achievements of Victorian women's political organising. Those achievements were real, and they mattered enormously. But it is a reason to be honest about the limits of female solidarity when class differences remained unacknowledged. The working-class women who were in many ways most in need of legal protection and political representation were the women least likely to be included in the friendship networks that were generating that protection and representation. This was a blind spot that some Victorian women activists recognised and tried to address. The settlement house movement, particularly the work done at Toynbee Hall, and later at institutions like Hull House in the United States, founded by Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr, who were themselves in a deep and lifelong female partnership, was in part an attempt to build bridges across exactly this class gap. Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr had met at Rockford Female Seminary in Illinois in 1877. Their friendship, which began in a school that was itself a product of the belief that women's education mattered, grew into a professional and personal partnership that sustained Hull House from its founding in 1889 through decades of social reform work. The friendships formed at institutions like Rockford and at the new women's colleges that were beginning to appear in England and America in the latter half of the 19th century were the seedbed of an entire generation of social reformers. The women's colleges deserve a moment here because they represent something genuinely new in the history we have been tracing. Girton College at Cambridge was founded in 1869. Newnham College followed in 1871. In the United States, the so-called Seven Sisters Colleges, Vassar Wellesley Smith, Radcliffe, Mount Holyoke, Bryn Mawr Barnard, were founded in rapid succession between 1861 and 1889. These institutions changed everything. For the first time, women had access to spaces for sustained intellectual community spaces that were not drawing rooms, not finishing schools, not the domestic sphere of the home, but genuine intellectual environments, with libraries and lecture halls and the daily proximity of other women who were serious about ideas. The friendships formed in those environments had a different quality from what had come before. They were formed in a context of shared intellectual work, of the particular camaraderie of people who are learning hard things together, of the kind of bond that develops when you stay up until 2 a.m, arguing about something that matters to you. And the women who met in those colleges, who formed those friendships in those intense, intellectually charged environments, went out into the world with networks that were not just socially warm, but professionally functional. Networks that could organise, advocate, publish, fundraise, and eventually vote. The suffrage organisations of the late 19th and early 20th centuries were staffed in disproportionate numbers by women who had known each other at Girton or Newnham or Vassar or Wellesley, who had been friends before they were colleagues, who trusted each other with their whole selves before they trusted each other with political strategy. Let me ask you something that I think is worth sitting with. If you look at almost any major social movement in history, any sustained organised effort to change something fundamental about the way society is structured, what you find at the centre of it is not primarily an ideology or a strategy or a charismatic leader. What you find is a web of relationships, people who trusted each other enough to take risks together, people who sustained each other through the long periods when nothing was working, people whose personal loyalty to each other kept them at the table when their commitment to the abstract cause might have faltered. The suffrage movement was not different from this. It was the clearest possible illustration of it. And what made the suffrage movement's friendship networks distinctive, what gave them their particular quality of sustained depth and personal devotion, was everything we have been exploring in this story. The decades of friendship culture that had taught Victorian women how to form deep bonds, how to maintain them across distance and difficulty, how to trust each other with the truth, how to show up consistently for the people who mattered to them. They had been practicing this their whole lives. The political movement did not create the friendship skills. The friendship skills built the political movement. There is one final figure I want to mention in this part of our story because she represents something about the relationship between friendship and courage that I find genuinely moving. Her name was Sophia Jex Blake. She was one of the first women to study medicine in Britain, one of the famous Edinburgh Seven, a group of women who enrolled at the University of Edinburgh Medical School in 1869 and faced sustained, sometimes violent opposition from male students and faculty who were determined to force them out. The Edinburgh Seven were not random individuals who happened to apply to the same program at the same time. They were women who knew each other, who had been recruited and encouraged and supported by each other through the process of applying, through the battles with the university administration, through the public hostility that their presence in the medical school generated. When male students and hostile faculty pelted them with mud and rubbish at a practical anatomy examination in November 1870, in an incident that became known as the Surgeons' Hall riot, the Seven did not run. They walked through the crowd together into the examination hall and took the examination. That image, 7 women walking together through a hostile crowd, is to me the whole story of Victorian female friendship and its political consequences in a single moment. Courage calls to courage everywhere, but first you have to be standing close enough to hear it. The suffrage movement succeeded. In Britain in 1918, women over 30 who met a property qualification were granted the right to vote. Full equal suffrage came in 1928. In the United States, the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920. These were victories built on decades of organizing, on thousands of committee meetings and petition drives and public speeches and parliamentary lobbying campaigns. But underneath all of that formal machinery of political change, there was something older and quieter and more fundamental. There was the friendship that had started in drawing rooms and finishing schools and women's colleges, and the long hours of letter writing after the penny post made distant connection affordable. The friendship that had learned over generations how to be honest and how to be loyal, and how to sustain itself through the ordinary and extraordinary difficulties of women's lives. That friendship did not end when the votes were won. It did not become less necessary, less relevant, less worth understanding. It just moved on to the next thing that needed doing. But here is the question that I keep returning to as we reach the final chapters of this story. We've spent this evening exploring the rules of Victorian female friendship, the rituals and the codes and the objects and the letters and the grief and the courage. We have seen how those friendships worked and what they built and what they cost. And now I want to ask something that I think the whole story has been quietly building toward. What did Victorian women understand about female friendship that we have lost? What did the etiquette manuals and the drawing rooms and the calling cards and the decades of carefully cultivated social practice know about human connection that our faster, louder, more openly labelled world has perhaps forgotten? The answers are not what I expected when I first started asking the question, and they are not comfortable, but they are, I think, genuinely important. We are almost there, just a little further. So we've arrived at the question I promised you. What did Victorian women understand about friendship that we have lost? And I want to be honest with you before I try to answer it, because I think honesty is the only useful approach here. This is not a question with a clean answer. It is not a question where I can hand you a tidy list of lessons and send you off feeling instructed. Anyone who tells you that history offers simple prescriptions for modern life is selling something, and I would rather give you the complicated truth than a comfortable simplification. But I do think there are things in this history, real specific historically grounded things that point towards something we are genuinely missing. And I want to name them as precisely as I can because I think they deserve more than vague nostalgia. So let us be honest together. The first thing Victorian women understood about friendship that we have largely forgotten is this. Friendship requires a container, not a metaphorical container, a literal one. A physical space, a recurring time, a set of rituals that holds the friendship in place and gives it somewhere to exist in the actual world rather than just in intention. We have talked across this entire story about the elaborate social architecture of Victorian female friendship, the calling cards, the morning visits, the rules of introduction, the long letters, the extended stays, the friendship albums, and the hair jewellery and all the rest of it. And I think we have understood as we went that these rituals were not arbitrary. They were doing real work, they were the container. Victorian women did not wait to feel like maintaining their friendships before they maintained them. The rituals did not depend on feeling. They existed whether or not you were in the mood, whether or not life was going smoothly, whether or not you had anything particularly important to say. The visit happened on schedule. The letter went out on Sunday. The card was left when the friend was not home, not because it accomplished much practically, but because the act of showing up even to an empty house, even symbolically, was part of the language of care. We have dismantled almost all of this. We have replaced the container with the intention. We mean to call. We think about reaching out. We feel warmth toward people we have not actually seen in 2 years. and we mistake the feeling of warmth for the practice of friendship, and we are genuinely surprised when the friendship gradually empties out. The Victorians would not have been surprised. They knew that love without practice is just sentiment, and sentiment, however genuine, does not show up when things get hard. In 1884, a Scottish philosopher named Alexander Bain published a book called Practical Essays, in which he argued that human habits are formed not by decision, but by repetition, that the physical action performed consistently, regardless of feeling, gradually shapes the mind toward wanting to perform it. This idea would be developed much more famously by William James a few years later, and it would eventually become one of the foundational insights of modern behavioral psychology. But Victorian women has been living it for generations before anyone wrote it down. The ritual of the morning call was not designed to feel spontaneous. It was designed to feel obligatory, pleasant yes, anticipated with genuine warmth, when the friendship was good but obligatory. You went, you left your card, you received, you wrote your letters, and in that repetition something was sustained that the best intentions in the world cannot sustain by intention alone. The second thing Victorian women understood, and this one I find more uncomfortable because it challenges something we're quite proud of, is that friendship needs formality. Not coldness, not the absence of warmth, but structure, boundaries, a degree of ceremony that acknowledges the importance of the relationship by treating it as something that deserves care rather than something that can be taken for granted. We live in an era that values informality as a marker of authenticity. The more casual a relationship we tend to feel, the more real it is. The elimination of ceremony, the first name on the first meeting, the immediate text-speak familiarity, the assumption of easy access, this reads to us as closeness. Victorian women would have found this genuinely puzzling. They understood formality not as distance but as respect. The careful calibration of address, the gradual movement from miss to first name, the protocols of introduction and visitation, these were not obstacles to intimacy. They were the scaffolding within which intimacy developed at a pace that allowed it to be real rather than performed. Think about what you actually know about most people you meet and immediately feel casual with. How much of that casualness represents genuine knowledge of each other, and how much of it is just the performance of informality, this social script of easy friendliness that our culture has decided is the appropriate default. Victorian women spent months building toward the level of familiarity that we perform in the first 5 minutes. And the friendships they built in that slower, more deliberate way, those friendships lasted decades, survived crises, held through the most difficult passages of life, with a tensile strength that we can still feel in their letters 150 years later. I'm not saying we should go back to calling each other miss and leaving cards, obviously, but I think there is something in the underlying principle, the idea that a friendship worthy of the name deserves to be treated with a degree of intentional care that we have perhaps been too casual about discarding. Here is the third thing, and it is the one I think about most. Victorian women understood that friendship is not a supplement to a real life. It is part of the structure of a real life. We have a cultural hierarchy of relationships that places romantic partnership at the top, family below that, and friendship somewhere further down, important yes, but essentially optional. When life gets full and time gets scarce, friendship is typically the first thing to compress. The friend who used to get the long phone call on Sunday now gets a quick text on Thursday. The visit that used to happen every few months has not happened in 2 years. The friendship is still there, you tell yourself. It is just on hold. Victorian middle-class women organised their social world differently. Female friendship was not optional. It was not the leisure activity that got dropped when the schedule filled. It was central to social life, to emotional sustenance, to the practical support systems that carried women through illness and childbirth and bereavement and all the ordinary crises of life. The morning call was not extra. It was the structure around which other things were arranged. The historian Carol Smith Rosenberg, whose work on Victorian female friendship we touched on in an earlier part of this story, documented this with particular precision. She found in her extensive reading of women's letters and diaries from the 19th century that women described their female friendships not as additions to their lives, but as the emotional foundation of them. The people they turned to first in difficulty, the people whose opinion mattered most in decision-making, the people whose presence or absence most directly shaped the quality of daily experience. Husbands were important, children were important, but the female friend was the person who knew you as a person, as an individual with an interior life rather than as a role. There is a researcher named Julianne Holt-Lundstad, a psychologist at Brigham Young University, who published a landmark analysis in 2015 on the relationship between social connection and physical health. What she found after reviewing data from 148 studies involving over 300,000 participants was that social isolation carries a health risk comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. 15 cigarettes a day. Loneliness, her data showed, increases mortality risk by approximately 26%, and the rates of loneliness in the United States and across the Western world have been climbing steadily for decades. A survey conducted by the health company Cigna in 2018 found that nearly half of Americans reported sometimes or always feeling alone, and that Generation Z people born between approximately 1997 and 2012 was the loneliest generation ever recorded. This is not a small problem. This is a public health crisis, and it is happening in the most connected era in human history, in the era of social media and instant messaging and video calls and 1,000 different platforms designed explicitly to facilitate human connection. Something is not working. And I think the Victorian friendship culture we've been exploring all evening points at least in part toward what we have access that Victorian women could not have imagined. We have speed, we have volume, we have the ability to be in contact with hundreds of people simultaneously, to know in real time what our friends had for breakfast, to see photographs of their children's birthdays and their holiday trips and the books they are reading. What we have lost is depth. The Victorian friendship letter, the one that took an hour to write and arrived 2 days later and demanded an hour of attention, to read properly that letter forced a quality of presence that the instant message structurally cannot produce. When you write a letter, you think before you write. You assemble yourself. You decide what you actually want to say rather than saying the first thing that comes to mind. The process of writing, the physical slowness of it, the knowledge that the letter will arrive days later and be read in a particular act of attention, all of that shapes what gets said and how it gets said. When you write an instant message, the medium discourages all of that. Speed is the value, brevity is the norm. The message is written in the margins of another activity, read in the margins of another activity, and leaves no trace in the attention once the notification has been cleared. I am not being nostalgic for quill pens. Email can be long and thoughtful. A voice message can carry real warmth. The technology is not the problem. The problem is the pace. The problem is the habit of surface contact repeated hundreds of times a day as a substitute for the deep contact that can only happen a few times slowly with sustained attention. Victorian women, for all their constraints, for all the ways their world was narrower and less free than ours, had by structural necessity that sustained attention. They could not scroll. They could not multitask. When they visited, they visited. When they wrote, they wrote. The friendship had their whole self because there was nothing else competing for it in that moment. We have everything competing for our attention in every moment. And our friendships are, I think, paying the price. Let me tell you about one specific Victorian practice that I think deserves to be revived, or at least thought about seriously. The practice of the friendship visit, the extended stay lasting days or weeks in a friend's home. This was, as we have discussed, entirely normal in Victorian female friendship. Women travelled to each other and stayed. They shared domestic space in a sustained way. They woke up in the same house, had breakfast together, spent the long middle hours of the day in each other's proximity, went to sleep, knowing they would begin again the next morning. This is radically different from the dinner visit or the coffee meetup that constitutes most of our friendship maintenance today. Not because dinner visits are bad, but because the extended stay produces something that dinner visits structurally cannot. It produces the experience of knowing someone in their ordinariness. In the extended stay, you see your friend when she's tired. You see how she handles a small frustration. You notice what she reaches for when she is sad. You observe the rhythms of her daily life when she is most energetic, when she withdraws, what she is like before she's assembled herself for the world. This is the knowledge that produces real intimacy, not the curated self that appears at dinner and disappears afterward, but the actual person living inside an actual day. Victorian women built their deepest friendships in this kind of intimate domestic proximity. And the depth of those friendships, the quality we can still feel in the letters, the sureness of the knowledge they had of each other came in significant part from that proximity. Now, I want to be honest about the limits of this comparison because I think intellectual honesty matters more than a satisfying narrative. Victorian female friendship culture was built on the backs of enormous constraint. The depth of those friendships was partly a product of the fact that women had so little else. No career, no public life, no vote, no property, no independent legal existence after marriage. The richness of the interior world they built was inseparable from the poverty of the exterior world they were permitted. I would not trade our freedoms for their depth. I do not think anyone should. The expansion of women's public life, the access to education, to profession, to political participation, to legal personhood, these are not incidental gains. They are the fundamental stuff of human dignity. But I do think we need to be honest that we have not found adequate substitutes for what was lost when the interior world of Victorian female friendship gave way to the larger, more various but sometimes shallower world of modern women's lives. The challenge is not to go backward. It is to go forward in a way that holds on to something, to find the modern equivalent of the long letter, the extended visit, the deliberate, sustained, unhurried practice of showing up for the people who matter, not as a nostalgic recreation of something past, but as a genuine response to a genuine need that has not gone away simply because the social structure that used to address it has. Victoria's women, for all their invisible cages, for all the rules that constrained them, and the language that was denied them, and the rights they did not have, those women knew something about human connection that we are slowly, painfully rediscovering. They knew that love is not a feeling, it is a practice. They knew that intimacy does not happen by accident. It is built deliberately over time with attention and ritual, and the repeated unglamorous work of showing up. They knew that the friend who has known you across many years, who has seen you grieve and argue and embarrass yourself and recover that friend, holds something irreplaceable. Something that no new connection, however exciting, can replicate. And they protected that knowledge fiercely with calling cards and hair jewellery, and 20-page letters and the whole elaborate, slightly absurd, genuinely beautiful architecture of Victorian female friendship. We have almost reached the end of tonight's story. But before we arrive there, I want to take you somewhere unexpected. Because everything we have discovered, the rituals, the letters, the hair jewellery, the Boston marriages, the suffrage networks, the grief, the resilience, all of it has been living in a specific historical moment. The Victorian era, the long 19th century, And now I want to ask what all of it means when we lift our eyes from the historical record and look at where we actually are, right now, tonight, in this particular moment. Because I think the final lesson of Victorian female friendship is not a historical lesson at all. It is a personal one. And I think you already know what it is, but I want to say it carefully and fully, and in the way it deserves to be said. We are almost there. Something shifted in the Victorian novel around 1870. It is subtle enough that you might miss it if you are reading quickly, but if you slow down and pay attention, if you read the novels of the 1840s and 50s, alongside the novels of the 1870s and 80s, you notice that something in the emotional landscape has changed. The earlier novels, Jane Eyre Dombey and Sun Vanity Fair, take female friendship seriously, but they tend to treat it as background, as context. The important relationships are the romantic ones, the familial ones. The female friendships are there warm and real, but they exist at the edges of the story rather than at its centre. By the 1870s, something has shifted to the foreground. George Eliot's Middlemarch, published in 1871 and 1872, is organised around female relationships in a way that earlier Victorian fiction simply was not. The bonds between Dorothea and Rosamond, between Mary Garth and her understanding of her own worth, between all the women in the novel and the social structures that shape their choices, these are not background. They are the mechanism by which the novel thinks. Thomas Hardy, writing in the same decade, was doing something similar. His women observe each other with an intensity that his men rarely bring to anything. And then in the 1880s and 90s, a new kind of fiction appears. Fiction written almost entirely from within the female world. Fiction that takes the interior life of women's relationships, including their relationships with each other, as its primary subject and its primary dramatic territory. This was not a coincidence. The fiction changed because the culture was changing. And the culture was changing in part because the friendship networks we've been exploring were producing women who understood their own inner lives well enough to demand that literature reflect them. Let me tell you about a writer who I think deserves more attention than she typically receives in the story of Victorian female friendship. Her name was Mary Cholmondeley. She was born in 1859 in Shropshire, the daughter of a country rector, and she spent most of her life in circumstances that were by any material measure quite limited. She was not wealthy. She was not metropolitan. She did not move in the glamorous literary circles of London. She was frequently ill-plagued by the kind of chronic fatigue that confined many Victorian women to their drawing rooms more than they would have chosen. And she wrote one of the most searingly honest novels about women's inner lives that the Victorian era produced. The novel is called Red Pottage, published in 1898. It has two central characters, Hester Gresley and Rachel West, and the relationship between them is without question the emotional centre of the book, not the romantic subplot, not the marriage plot, the friendship. What Cholmondeley does in Red Pottage that almost no Victorian novelist had done quite so explicitly before is make female friendship the thing that saves a life. Not metaphorically, practically, structurally. The friendship between Hester and Rachel is what holds Hester together when everything else in her world is actively working to destroy her. Her brother's jealousy, society's indifference, her own self-doubt. Rachel's steadiness, Rachel's clear-eyed knowledge of who Hester actually is the ground under Hester's feet when the ground everywhere else gives way. Cholmondeley was writing about something real, something she had observed in the lives of women around her, something she had perhaps experienced herself in the close female friendships that sustained her through years of illness and constraint. She was writing the truth that the friendship culture of the Victorian era had been quietly living for decades, and putting it plainly on the page that a woman's female friendship can be the most life-sustaining relationship she has. Not second to something else, not supplementary, the thing itself, But here is where the history takes one of its most interesting turns. Because at the very moment that Victorian fiction was beginning to fully acknowledge the depth and centrality of female friendship, at the very moment that writers like Cholmondeley were putting it honestly on the page, the cultural ground was shifting underneath it. The 1890s in Britain are a fascinating and somewhat turbulent decade in the history of women's relationships. They are the decade of the new woman, the cultural figure of the educated, independent, professionally ambitious woman who rejected the domestic ideal of the angel in the house and insisted on something larger. The new woman was a subject of enormous cultural anxiety. She was satirized in Punch. She was argued about in serious journals. She was praised by some and condemned by many. She represented a genuine social change, the emergence of a generation of women who'd been educated in the new women's colleges, who had professional ambitions, who were not willing to organize their entire lives around the requirements of domesticity. And the new woman's friendships looked different from those of her predecessors in certain ways. They were in some respects more visible, less careful about the particular social forms we've been discussing all evening, less mediated through the rituals of the calling card and the morning visit, more likely to be conducted in public spaces, lecture halls, suffrage meetings, professional environments rather than exclusively in the domestic sphere. But here is the irony. In other ways, the new woman's friendships were less protected than the passionate friendships of her Victorian predecessors, because the medical and psychological discourse of the 1890s, the work of the sexologists, the growing cultural awareness of sexual identity as a category, was beginning to cast a different light on intense female bonds, a more suspicious light, a more clinical light. The same emotional intensity that had been celebrated as the highest expression of feminine virtue in 1850 was being reread by 1895 as something potentially deviant, something that required scrutiny rather than celebration. The space that Victorian friendship culture had created, that warm, socially sanctioned, deliberately ambiguous space in which women could love each other with intensity and completeness, without anyone demanding that they categorize what exactly they meant by love that space was contracting. I want to be precise about this because I think it is one of the most consequential and least discussed developments in the history of female friendship. The contraction was not uniform. It did not happen all at once, and it was not simply imposed from outside. Some women welcomed the new medical frameworks as a way of claiming an identity and a community that had previously been nameless. But the practical effect for the broad culture of female friendship was a narrowing. Before the 1890s, a woman could write to her closest friend, "I love you," as wives, love their husbands, and neither of them needed to decide what that meant or what category it placed them in. The language was available, the social permission was available, the friendship could simply be what it was. After the cultural shifts of the 1890s and into the early 20th century, that same language became charged in a different way. It invited interpretation. It invited the question that the earlier culture had been perhaps deliberately not asking. And that invitation, or that pressure, changed things. Some women became more guarded in their correspondence, more careful in their language, more conscious of how their bonds with other women might be read from outside. The epistolary intimacy that had been so natural, so unremarkable for previous generations, now required a degree of self-consciousness that inevitably altered it. The friendship itself often remained, but the ease of expressing it, the cultural permission to use the fullest possible language without calculation, that ease diminished. Charlotte Perkins. Gilman understood something about this that most of her contemporaries were not quite seeing clearly. Gilman was an American writer and social theorist, one of the most penetrating feminist thinkers of the late Victorian and early Edwardian period. She's best known today for her short story The Yellow Wallpaper, published in 1892, which remains one of the most devastating accounts of women's psychological confinement in all of American literature. But it is her sociological work, particularly her book Women in Economics, published in 1898, that I want to draw on here. Gilman's central argument in Women in Economics was that women's economic dependence on men had distorted not just their material lives but their inner lives. That the requirement to be pleasing, to be domestically oriented, to organize one's personality around the requirements of attracting and retaining a husband, this had produced a kind of stunting, a narrowing of what women were permitted to develop in themselves. What Gilman did not fully articulate, but what the history we have been exploring all evening suggests, is that the female friendship culture of the Victorian era had been partly a corrective to that narrowing, a space where the stunted parts could breathe, where ambition and intelligence and the full range of emotional life could exist without the distorting pressure of the requirement to be pleasing. As that friendship culture contracted as the easy, generous, culturally sanctioned space of passionate female bonds gave way to something more guarded, the corrective contracted too. Women lost something that they had used to sustain themselves. Now I want to come back to the fiction, because I think the novels are in this period more honest about what was happening than the social history sometimes is. There is a novelist named Vernon Lee, the pen name of Violet Paget, an English writer based in Florence, who was writing in the 1880s and 90s with extraordinary psychological penetration about female inner life. Vernon Lee herself lived for many years in a close partnership with another woman, the artist Clementina Kit and Struther Thompson. Their relationship was the subject of considerable comment in the literary circles. They moved in comment that was depending on who was doing the commenting, admiring, puzzled, or subtly hostile. What Vernon Lee put into her fiction was a precise and uncomfortable analysis of the way women's inner lives got deformed by the requirements placed on them, her supernatural stories in particular, and she was one of the great practitioners of the Victorian ghost story, used the uncanny to explore the psychological costs of constraint, the things that do not get expressed, the feelings that have no legitimate outlet, the selves that get buried alive. Reading her now with the whole arc of the history we've been tracing laid out, her work feels like a kind of elegy, an elegy for the space that was closing, for the warmth that was cooling, for the language that was becoming unavailable. She was not only writing about the supernatural, she was writing about what happens to human beings when the things they need are taken away without anyone formally acknowledging that anything has been lost. Let me ask you something that I find genuinely difficult to answer. We have more language now than Victorian women had. More categories, more frameworks, more ways to name what we feel and who we are. We have more freedom to build our lives according to our own understanding of what we need. We have legal protections that those women could not have imagined. All of that is real. All of that matters. And yet, the loneliness data we talked about in the last part of this story is also real. The epidemic of shallow connection in a world saturated with contact is real. The particular loss of the deep female friendship, the one sustained over decades, built in the deliberate, unhurried way that Victorian women built things that loss, is real. I wonder sometimes whether part of what we lost as the Victorian friendship culture gave way to the 20th century's very different social landscape was a certain kind of permission. Permission to need each other that directly. Permission to say so with that language. Permission to organize your life around a female friendship in a way that your whole social world understood and supported. That permission, fragile, constrained, built on the specific and not always admirable foundations of Victorian gender ideology, was also real. And it produced real things, real depth, real sustenance, real lives. Here is the specific historical moment I keep returning to when I think about all of this. 1895, the year of the Oscar Wilde trials in England, the year that perhaps more than any other single year marks the cultural moment when the Victorian tolerance for intimate same-gender bonds, the tolerance that had sheltered Ann Lister and Charlotte Cushman and Sarah Orne Jewett, and the thousands of ordinary women who had simply loved each other in the most complete ways available to them, began definitively to collapse. The Wilde trials did not directly concern women's friendships. The legal and social machinery that came down on Wilde had no female equivalent. There was no law against female intimacy, partly because the Victorian belief in women's natural asexuality made it literally legally unthinkable. But the cultural effect was not gender-specific. What the Wilde trials produced was a heightened consciousness of intimate same-gender bonds as a category, as something that could be seen, named, and judged. The previously undefined space in which women had loved each other without categorization now had a kind of shadow over it. Not a legal shadow, but a social one. A new self-consciousness, a new awareness that the warm, passionate, openly expressed love between women was no longer quite as invisible as it had been, and that awareness changed things. The letters became a little shorter, the language became a little more careful, the long visits became less easy to arrange, the friendship albums gathered dust, not all at once, not completely. The Victorian friendship culture did not disappear overnight, but it began quietly and irrevocably to fade. And yet, here is what I want to leave you with before we reach the final part of this story. The women did not stop loving each other. The friendship did not end. It could not be legislated away or medically classified into non-existence or shamed out of being. The need was too fundamental, the love was too real. What changed was the form, the ease, the cultural permission, but underneath all of that, sustaining itself through the 20th century in ways that the history books rarely document, with the same attention they gave to the Victorian era, the deep female friendship continued. It continued in the suffrage movement and in the settlement houses and in the women's colleges, and in the quiet, uncelebrated intimacies of ordinary women's ordinary lives all the way through the decades that followed. It continued because it was necessary, because human beings, given the chance to know each other fully, to know each other in the slow, careful, unhurried way that Victorian women had modelled, will reach for that knowledge regardless of what the cultural weather is doing. They will find the language even when the old language is no longer available. They will build the space even when the social architecture no longer provides one. Because the need is not Victorian, the need is human. And the story of what that need has produced all the way from a calling card left on a silver tray in an 1860 London drawing room to the conversation we're having right now, you and I in whatever room you're lying in tonight, that story is not over. It is in some important sense still just beginning. And now we've arrived at the last part of our journey tonight. The part where I stop telling you about the history and start asking what it asks of us. What does 100 years of Victorian female friendship, all that love and grief and courage and coded diary and braided hair and 20-page letter and deliberate, sustained, fierce, complicated, beautiful practice of being known, what does all of it say to us tonight here in this moment? The answer is simpler than you might expect, and more demanding. Right now, tonight, somewhere in the world, I'm almost certain of this. There are two women sitting together in a room. Maybe they're drinking something warm. Maybe one of them is on the couch and the other is cross-legged on the floor the way old friends arrange themselves without thinking. Maybe they have known each other for 20 years or 2 years or 40. Maybe they have not seen each other in a long time and the catching up feels slightly effortful at first, and then suddenly, without quite identifying the moment it happened, it does not feel effortful at all. Maybe one of them is going through something hard and has not told anyone else. Maybe she is about to tell it now here to this specific person, because this is the person she trusts with the unedited version, And in that room, in that conversation, something that has been happening for as long as women have been sitting in rooms together is happening again. Something old, something necessary, something that does not require a Victorian calling card or a penny post letter or a locket full of braided hair to be real. It is just real. It has always just been real. We have travelled a long way tonight. We started in a London drawing room in the 1850s watching a woman leave a calling card on a silver tray, and we followed the thread of Victorian female friendship across more than a century, through the letters and the hair jewellery and the etiquette manuals and the finishing schools, and the passionate correspondences and the Boston marriages and Anne Lister's coded diary, and the grief of watching a best friend walk down an aisle, and the courage of 7 women walking together through a hostile crowd. We have watched friendship become language, and language become politics, and politics become history. And now we are here, at the question that the whole story has been quietly building toward. Not what did Victorian women do, but what did they know? And I think, having spent all this time with them, having read their words and traced their lives and followed their friendships across the decades of the 19th century, I think I can tell you what they knew. They knew that to be fully known by another person is one of the most profound things a human life can contain. Not known in the curated, managed, best foot forward way that we tend to present ourselves to the world. Not known through the highlight reel. Known in the way that only sustained, patient, unhurried attention makes possible, in all your ordinariness, in all your difficulty across all the years and changes that life brings. That knowledge, the knowledge of being truly seen, is not a luxury. It is not a supplement to a real life. It is part of what makes a life real. The psychologist and researcher Brené Brown, whose work on vulnerability and human connection has reached more people than almost any other researcher of her generation, has spent decades documenting what the data shows about human flourishing. And what the data shows consistently is that the quality of our close relationships is the single strongest predictor of well-being. Stronger than income, stronger than health to a point, stronger than almost any other variable you can measure, not the quantity of relationships. The quality, the depth, the degree to which we feel genuinely known and genuinely knowing of the people we call close. Victorian women, without the benefit of psychological research, and without the cultural permission to discuss their needs in those terms, had organized their entire social world around exactly this truth. They had built a whole civilization of female friendship around the practice of deep knowing, and we have in our faster and more various and in many ways freer world let much of that practice slip. Here is the specific thing I want to say about what we have lost and what we could reclaim, not as a nostalgic gesture, as a practical one. We have lost the habit of the long letter. Not the medium email exists, and a long thoughtful email can do much of what the Victorian letter did. What we have lost is the habit. The practice of sitting down regularly and assembling ourselves into words for someone we love, of thinking about what we actually want to say before we say it, of giving a friendship an hour of our undivided attention rather than 30 seconds of divided attention scattered across 100 notifications. We have lost the practice of the extended visit, the days spent in someone's house eating their food, seeing their morning face, knowing what their ordinary Tuesday actually looks like. The intimacy that only comes from proximity over time, not performance over an evening. We have lost the ritual. The thing that happens on schedule, regardless of mood, regardless of circumstance, that keeps the friendship alive during the long stretches when nothing dramatic is happening, when there is no obvious reason to reach out, when life is just busy and slightly monotonous and ticking along without crisis. The Victorians understood that love without practice is just sentiment. They built practices, elaborate, slightly exhausting, occasionally absurd practices, and inside those practices they built friendships that lasted lifetimes. We can do this, not with calling cards, not with morning visits paid in gloves, but with something, some deliberate, consistent, chosen practice that says to the person we care about, you are not an afterthought. You're not someone I will get to when things calm down. You are in my schedule. You are a priority. You are someone I show up for. There is a woman I want to tell you about who is not Victorian at all. She lived and died in the 20th century, and her story is less than 100 years old, and yet she understood something about female friendship that connects her directly to every woman we have discussed tonight. Her name was Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt is best known as the wife of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd President of the United States, and as one of the most active and consequential First Ladies in American history. She is known for her human rights advocacy, for her work with the United Nations, for her extraordinary public voice in an era when women's public voices were still not fully accepted. What is less often discussed is the central role that female friendship played in Eleanor Roosevelt's life, and the degree to which those friendships were the emotional foundation on which everything else she did was built. Eleanor Roosevelt had a small, intensely close circle of female friends, women she'd known for decades, women she wrote to constantly, women she visited, and who visited her women, who knew her inner life in the way that only old, deep, sustained friendship permits. Among them was a journalist named Lorena Hickok, known to everyone who knew her as Hick, with whom Eleanor maintained a correspondence of over 3,000 letters over more than 30 years. The letters are passionate, detailed, entirely unguarded. Eleanor wrote to Hick in terms that echo uncannily the letters of the Victorian women we have been exploring all evening. The same directness, the same emotional fullness, the same refusal to manage and reduce what she felt into something more socially manageable. Whatever the exact nature of their bond, and historians have debated this, with the same energy they have brought to all the similar debates we have touched on. What is beyond debate is this: Lorena Hickok was one of the most important people in Eleanor Roosevelt's life. And Eleanor Roosevelt, who changed the world in more ways than most people get to change it in a dozen lifetimes, was not diminished by that friendship. She was sustained by it. The friendship was part of how she did what she did. I have a small theory about this. It is only a theory, but I believe in it. I believe that the women who have done the most, who have built the most, changed the most, contributed the most to the world they lived in, have almost always had at the center of their lives at least one female friendship of the kind we've been describing all evening. Not always. There are exceptions. But look at the women we have discussed tonight: Barbara Bodichon organizing her drawing room gatherings, Millicent Garrett Fawcett sustained by her sisters and colleagues, Frances Power Cobb anchored by her partnership with Mary Lloyd, Eleanor Roosevelt writing to Lorena Hickok, Sarah Orne Jewett building a life and a body of work with Annie Fields, all of them grounded, all of them held, all of them doing their most important work from within the stability that a deep female friendship provided. I do not think this is a coincidence. I think the friendship was the ground, the thing they stood on when everything else was uncertain, the place where their full selves were known and therefore where their full selves were available to do the work that the world needed them to do. And I think this is true not only for the women who changed history. I think it is true for ordinary women living ordinary lives who simply needed, as all of us need, the sustenance of being genuinely known. Let me tell you something that happened in a research study that I found quietly devastating. In 2006, researchers at Duke University published a study in the American Sociological Review that had been tracking changes in American social networks over 20 years. In 1985, they had asked Americans how many close confidants they had, people they could discuss important matters with. The most common answer was 3. In 2004, they asked the same question of a new cohort. The most common answer, 0. Not 1, not 2, 0. Nearly a quarter of the people surveyed said they had nobody, not a single person in whom they could fully confide. 0. When I first read that statistic, I had to put it down for a moment, because embedded in that number is a kind of quiet catastrophe that does not make headlines, does not produce dramatic public crises, but sits underneath the surface of millions of lives as a constant low-level ache. Victorian women, with all their constraints and all their invisible cages, would not have recognized that number. The idea of having 0 people, no one you could tell the truth to, no one who knew your inner life, no one you could call your real confidant, would have represented a kind of poverty of existence that they worked every day of their lives to prevent. They worked deliberately, consistently, with effort and ritual and attention to make sure that number was never 0. We have somewhere in the last few decades stopped working at it. And I think the history we have been exploring tonight is an invitation to start again. So here is what I want to leave you with. Not a to-do list, not a productivity hack for better friendships, just a question and a suggestion. The question is, who is the person in your life who knows you most truly, not the person you are most in contact with? Not the person you see most often, the person who knows the unedited version, the person who's been present across enough time and enough of your life's changes to have some real sense of who you actually are. Do they know that? Does the quality of your attention to that friendship reflect how much it actually matters? And the suggestion, gentle, completely optional, but I mean it, is this: write someone a letter, not a text, not an email dashed off in 3 minutes, a letter. Something that takes time, something that requires you to sit down and think about what you actually want to say. Something that when it arrives says by its very existence, you matter enough to me that I gave you an hour of my full attention. The Victorians knew something about this that we have forgotten, that the act of writing, the slow, deliberate physical act of choosing words and setting them down on paper, does something to the writer as well as to the reader. It makes you articulate what you feel. It makes you present with the relationship in a way that passing contact cannot replicate. It is in its quiet way an act of love. You do not need to be eloquent. You do not need to have anything important to say. You just need to show up on the page for someone who matters to you. That is the whole of it. We have spent this evening with women who built extraordinary things out of ordinary materials, who took the scraps of freedom their world offered them, a calling card, a visiting hour, a sheet of paper and a penny stamp, and made from those scraps something that sustained them and sometimes sustained history. They did not have our freedoms. They did not have our vocabulary, or our legal protections, or our public voice. They did not have the ability to simply be who they were without calculation and strategy, and often some degree of private grief. But they had each other. With extraordinary care and deliberateness across centuries of constraint, they had each other. And in having each other, in building those friendships with such sustained, patient, unhurried attention, they demonstrated something that I think we need now as much as they did then, that human beings are not meant to be navigated alone, that the interior life of a person, however rich, however capacious, requires the witness of another person to be fully real. That love, including the love between friends, the love that does not fit neatly into any of the categories our culture has named and celebrated, is not a luxury or a supplement or an extra. It is as the Victorian women who braided each other's hair and wrote each other 20-page letters and walked together through hostile crowds already knew simply necessary. We began tonight behind the parlour door, and what we found there in all those letters and rituals and coded diaries and lockets and friendship albums and drawing room conversations and lifelong partnerships was not what I expected when I first started following this thread. I expected to find constraint, and I found it. I expected to find sadness, and I found that too, but mostly, most unexpectedly, I found warmth, An extraordinary, sustained, deliberately cultivated human warmth that reached across everything the Victorian world threw at it, the class hierarchies and the legal restrictions and the medical surveillance and the grief of weddings and the slow closing of the cultural space and kept burning anyway. That warmth is not Victorian. It is ours too if we choose to tend it. Thank you. Genuinely, from wherever I sit writing this to wherever you're lying listening, thank you for spending this time here in this corner of history with me. If this story reached something in you, if there is a name that has been running through your mind while you listened, someone you've been meaning to reach out to, someone who deserves an hour of your full attention, I hope you do something about it. Not tomorrow, soon. Because the calling card you leave on their silver tray does not have to be made of cardboard. It just has to say, I was thinking of you. You matter. I showed up. That is enough. It has always been enough. If this journey through Victorian friendship has meant something to you tonight, leave a comment below. Tell me about a friendship in your own life that this story brought to mind. I read every single one, and those comments are in their small way their own kind of correspondence, their own kind of showing up. And if you want to keep exploring these hidden corners of history, the stories that do not make it into the textbooks, but that carry the most human truth, then stay close. There is another story waiting, one with its own locked doors and its own hidden languages and its own remarkable cast of people who refuse to be only what their world told them to be. You will not want to miss it. Sleep well tonight, and when you wake up, write that letter.